Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. American Comics. The Beginning of the Fusion of the Motherland. Chapter 81. Swish. At the moment when Rorschach's heat ray came over, the eagle-winged man immediately spread his wings, turned his body nimbly, and dodged Rorschach's fatal blow. Then he just floated in the air, folded his arms, looked at Rorschach with a cold face, and his face was full of solemnity. Shao was right, this man is indeed a big trouble. The other party's eyes can actually emit heat rays. This ability is really too abnormal. For all mutants, it is a natural and huge threat. Not to mention, this person also has strength, speed, and defense that surpass ordinary people, and there seems to be no shortcomings in all aspects. Even Shao was defeated by this person. With this person, it would be a bit tricky to get rid of the guy who can control magnetism. As for Rorschach, he also did not continue to attack the eagle-winged man. The reason is that the extremely limited space of the Blackbird fighter restricted Rorschach's performance. After all, he couldn't just cut the Blackbird fighter into pieces and then kill the eagle-winged man, right? Anyway, the shore was in sight. As long as everyone got ashore, Rorschach could easily deal with a character like the eagle-winged man. Of course, in fact, Charles's ability to deal with these minions was even more abnormal and open. After all, he didn't have to do anything. He just put his hand on his temple and, to freeze the eagle-winged man, making him lose consciousness and fall into the sea and drown. But it was a pity. At this moment, Charles put all his energy on breaking the mental barrier in the nuclear submarine, but he had no time to take care of other things. In fact, the moment Eric pulled the nuclear submarine out of the water, Charles noticed that there was a place inside the nuclear submarine that isolated his mental detection. Just like the time in the hotel in Manhattan. Charles knew that Shao must be hiding there. Although Charles was helpless against this energy barrier in Manhattan, now, it was related to the future world pattern. How could Charles dare to be negligent? Naturally, he tried his best to break the barrier. So much so that he had no energy to take care of those minions. Anyway, with the abilities of other X-Men, they would not be unable to deal with those minions. In the original movie, it was the same. The X-Men fought with Riptide, Red Devil and the Angel who betrayed the past from beginning to end, and Charles did not intervene. Otherwise, those people did not even have a helmet. How could they be arrogant in front of Charles for so long? Until the X-Men dealt with all the minions and Eric found Shaw, Charles finally used his ability to freeze Shaw. Then Eric killed Shaw with a coin. In short, before finding Shaw, Charles could not be counted on anyway, and everyone could only rely on their own strength to deal with those people from the Hellfire Club. Fortunately, for the X-Men, this was not a difficult task. Nicholas. Another voice sounded, but it was after the eagle-winged man was forced away by Rorschach, and another person came out of the opponent's nuclear submarine. This is a bald man who looks extremely strong, with very pale skin, as white as the whitewash on the wall. People who don't know the truth may think that this man has a serious illness. But it is obvious that this is just an alienated appearance brought by his mutant ability, nothing more. The bald man is healthy. He looked up at the eagle-winged man in the air and shouted at him. That Oriental man is inside, I can't get close. The eagle-winged man shouted to the bald man a little helplessly. Fine, leave it to me. The bald man grinned, and suddenly stretched out his arms, and slapped the Blackbird fighter in front of him. It was just like the action of Hulk slapping Hulk attack. Boom! Along with the bald man's slap, a huge wave suddenly exploded in the water. The wave slapped the Blackbird fighter in the sky with an unstoppable momentum like a dam bursting. Shit, what is this? A huge wave is coming, Hank, be careful. Several exclamations came from the Blackbird fighter. Everyone hold on tight, we're going to be very bumpy next. While Hank began to quickly control the Blackbird fighter to dodge, he began to shout at the mutants. Charles, get down quickly. Rorschach said to Charles, then he suddenly lay on the ground, stretched out his hand, and grabbed Eric's hand. He immediately pulled Eric in. The next moment, boom! The huge wave directly submerged the Blackbird fighter, and the entire fighter couldn't help but shake violently. Then, like a leaf of duckweed, it shook violently. The mutants in the fighter were almost shaken to pieces by the huge impact force. They felt dizzy and the sun and moon lost their color, as if they were experiencing a major earthquake. But fortunately, everyone in the Blackbird was wearing seat belts. Rorschach was incredibly strong, and he could hold on to anything and still be as steady as an old dog. As for Eric, he used his ability to attach himself to the fighter. He was also holding Charles down, using himself as a seatbelt to hold Charles in place. Everyone was safe and sound. Boom, boom, boom. The next moment, the Blackbird fighter lost control and was forced to land on the shore by Hank. The violent vibration was even more severe than before. The first-generation Blackbird fighter, such a memorable thing, was smashed into ruins in an instant. The mutants almost vomited. Fortunately, everyone's protective measures were well done, so no one was injured. Cough, cough, cough. Is everyone okay? Mora, Raven, Charles, we're fine. Perhaps because he has the most powerful brain in the world, Charles looks a little thin, but he is the first to recover. The others are still dizzy, and Charles has already climbed up to check on everyone. As for Rorschach, he was already standing in the fighter plane. His face was not red and he was not out of breath, and even his hair was not messy, as if the crash just now did not exist at all. Without any nonsense, Rorschach, Charles, and Eric helped all the other mutants down from their seats, and the group walked out of the fighter plane. On the opposite coast, Xiao's nuclear submarine also fell to the ground, broke into pieces, and was completely destroyed. Outside the nuclear submarine, there were 4 people standing with their arms and swords. A bald man who could control water just now attacked everyone. A black man with dreadlocks, wearing sunglasses and very coquettish, with arms crossed. Another man who looked ordinary and had no special features for the time being. The last one was the eagle-winged man, who was just flapping his wings and floating in the air, looking very cool. Several people looked at Charles and others from a distance, and a puff of gunpowder spread out. I entered the mind of the gatekeeper. Xiao is absorbing the energy of the entire nuclear submarine. He is going to turn himself into a nuclear bomb. Charles's voice sounded, and his face was extremely solemn. He looked at the mutants opposite and said to the people around him, "We don't have time, the Geiger counter is almost out of range." Mora added on the side, "Okay, next we need to use the walkie-talkie to notify the fleets on both sides to start evacuating." Charles immediately said to Mora, "I'm going to stop him in the submarine." Eric made such a decision, and he was unequivocal. Although in terms of strength, the most suitable candidate to deal with Xiao is Rorschach rather than Eric, everyone is also aware of the grudge between Eric and Xiao, and they are not too surprised by this. Rorschach didn't compete with Eric for anything. Anyway, with his strength, it would not be difficult to kill Xiao after getting rid of the minions outside. Before that, maybe Eric would be severely ravaged by Xiao. Rorschach, Alex, Darwin, the other mutants are left to you. Charles also knew that Eric's decision was not the most ideal situation, but he still didn't say anything more. Instead, he asked Rorschach and the Devastator. As for Raven and Hank, well, they're at odds again. Needless to say, Ruiwen did not have any fighting skills at this time. Of course, she was much stronger than before, but there was still a long way to go in actual combat. The distance from being able to ravage Wolverine one-on-one later was even worse. Hank's situation is different from the original situation. Thanks to Rorschach's help, Hank's mutant abilities have not been enhanced, so he is still just a mutant who can run faster than others, nothing more. Fighting or something like that won't help at all. But then again, everyone has their own area of expertise, and each mutant's ability also has its matching occasions. Raven and Hank are indeed not the type to fight head-on. It is definitely not a wise decision to ask them to charge head-on like Ravagers and sea monsters. Let's do this. The Ravager is full of energy now. Eric, after you go in, follow my instructions, but I want you to clear all my obstacles. Charles said to Eric again. Eric nodded and began to rush directly towards the nuclear submarine in front. Don't even think about it. A cold snort came, but it was the eagle-winged man who let out a sneer. He just opened his wings and flew directly towards the crowd. Snapped. At this time, the bald man once again reached out and slapped the X-Men, and fired another, Hulk impact. Wow! Several waves of water exploded out from the sea behind him again, shooting towards the mutants. The water splash was not an ordinary wave, but a water sword, containing more powerful energy under the control of the bald man. Tisk tisk tisk. The ability of the Devastator is of great use at this time. His hands swung rapidly, and several circular energy waves were shot out. They scattered the splashes ejaculated by the bald man. Wow! A splash of water exploded from the sea behind, but the sea monster that had dived to the bottom of the sea suddenly rushed out and directly met the eagle-winged man flying towards everyone. Open your mouth. Buzz. A sound wave was fired at the eagle-winged man. The eagle-winged man swayed, and with a graceful and elegant dodge, he avoided the Kraken's sonic attack and flew directly towards the Kraken. Eagle-winged man and Siren are currently the only people on both teams who can fly, and their abilities have pros and cons. The advantage of the Kraken is that the sonic attack is a long-range attack that can be launched against the eagle-winged man from a distance, but the disadvantage is that its flight maneuverability is far from sufficient. After all, the Kraken's flight is just a kind of gliding. The eagle-winged man has real wings. In terms of flight maneuverability, it is far ahead of the Kraken, but its disadvantage is that it can only fight face-to-face and cannot carry out long-range attacks. Therefore, the battle situation between the two is still clear at a glance. The greater distance gave the Siren an advantage, and the shorter distance gave the eagle-winged man an advantage. What the eagle-winged man is doing now is exactly this, constantly swimming upstream under the attacks of the Kraken, trying to get in front of the Kraken. Judging from the current situation, the two sides may not be able to tell the winner for a while. At this time, other mutants also began to show their magical powers, and each launched a brutal attack on their opponents. A wonderful and dazzling battle between mutants broke out. The first battle begins. Swish, swish, swish. The sound continued to break through the air, but the roots of the dreadlocked black man seemed to be alive, and he continued to launch fierce attacks on Darwin in front of him. This is actually a Medusa. However, Darwin's body had already been transformed into steel, and he allowed the other party's whip to beat him mercilessly, just like being tickled, without feeling anything at all. Frankly speaking, Darwin's survival ability of the fittest is quite abnormal, but unfortunately it is a passive skill. And when the external stimulus that promotes the evolution of its ability disappears, the corresponding evolved ability will also disappear. Otherwise, this person will definitely be a big boss in the future. The man who does not seem to have any abnormality on the surface has abilities similar to those of the rapids, and both can create strong winds. This is a wind man. But the wind man's ability is different from that of the rapids. The strong winds created by the rapids are all hurricanes in the form of tornadoes, which are the kind of rotating winds. At the same time, the rapids can also be combined with water vapor in it to form a real rapids. But the wind man cannot create rotating winds. The wind man's winds are straight and cannot be combined with water vapor, but their power is not weak at all. It can easily blow a car away, and it is difficult for ordinary people to resist it. Whoosh! The wind man sent a large gust of wind to the X-Men, and immediately blew everyone upside down. In particular, Eric was the first to be attacked and was blown back by the opponent. This wind man who could attack enemies over a large area was the most troublesome. Luo Sha was the first to lock onto him and made him his target. Tisk! His eyes suddenly turned red, and two extremely blazing heat rays shot towards the wind man. Rorschach has long been on the Hellfire Club's list of people to watch. Although he is fighting with others, no one in the Hellfire Club dares to ignore Rorschach. They are all watching Rorschach all the time. Seeing Rorschach take action, how could Fengnan dare to be careless? He abandoned Eric at the first moment, and immediately leapt to the side, dodging Rorschach's heat ray at the critical moment. Swish! Two heat rays shot directly onto the beach next to Fengnan, making two pits on the beach. However, just as Rorschach continued to chase Fengnan and shoot, Fengnan suddenly waved his hand, and a gust of wind suddenly appeared in front of him. A large piece of sand was blown up, covering his figure in an instant. I have to say that Fengnan's move is still very clever. After all, you can't even see, no matter how powerful the ray is, how can it hit me? It's just a pity that Fengnan and the others still can't imagine Rorschach's true ability. In the eyes of the members of the Hellfire Club, the sand was enough to destroy Rorschach's heat ray, but in Rorschach's eyes, it could only cause a slight hindrance to himself, nothing more. That's right, just a slight hindrance, because Rorschach used his perspective eyes to look directly, and instantly penetrated the yellow sand, and immediately locked the exact position of the wind man. In addition, Rorschach's super hearing also locked the heart of the wind man. The yellow sand that was enough to block people's vision was completely useless to Rorschach. Tisk. Rorschach's heat ray continued to sweep non-stop, and began to shift his sight and continued to shoot at the Wind Man. But at this moment, Rorschach suddenly showed a cold smile, and his right hand suddenly stretched out to the right, grabbing the empty void. A voice came out immediately. At the same time, the light in front of him was distorted accordingly, and a figure slowly emerged in Rorschach's hand. A mutant who had never appeared before. A transparent man with the ability to be invisible, hiding in the dark from beginning to end, waiting for an opportunity to launch a fatal attack on Rorschach. And the transparent man was holding a short knife in his hand. That was not an ordinary knife, but a knife made of special metal, which could easily cut through steel plates. It was a knife specially used to kill Rorschach. This invisible man was the killer that Xiao prepared specifically to prevent Rorschach's arrival. But unfortunately, Black Emperor and others did not know that Rorschach also had super hearing. At the first time, Rorschach knew that the mutants sent by the Hellfire Club were not 4, but 5. He had heard the heartbeat of the transparent man a long time ago. The transparent man took advantage of the battle to approach Rorschach silently. Rorschach knew the whole process as if he was watching fire. Monitoring the whole process. How possible? You actually found me. The face of the transparent man showed extreme surprise. In such a chaotic battlefield, how did this person find himself? He did not reveal any flaws at all. Crack. But the invisible man would never be able to figure this out. Rorschach exerted force and directly broke the other's neck. Then he threw the invisible man's body on the ground like throwing away garbage. Then, Rorschach turned his head again. Swish. 2 heat rays shot out directly, passing through the yellow sand barrier that had not yet dissipated in front of him, and shot deep into it. Bang! The Wind Man in the yellow sand barrier flew out as if struck by lightning, and fell to the ground motionless. The raging wind in the sky stopped immediately. The figure of the Wind Man, whose life and death were uncertain, appeared in front of everyone. And next to Rorschach, the body of another strange man also appeared in front of everyone. The hearts of all the people in the Hellfire Club were fiercely pounded. How long has it been since the two sides fought, and 2 people have been killed? And Winston was killed so quickly. That was specially invited by Xiao to deal with the young man from the east. Unexpectedly, he was killed in the blink of an eye. The intelligence is wrong. The Oriental young man is more terrifying than the intelligence said. Well done, Rorschach. Eric's joyful voice sounded, and the other X-Men were also surprised and happy, and their morale could be said to be unprecedentedly soaring. Their opponents, however, felt great pressure. The Wind Man was killed, and the other mutants were also stopped by everyone. Eric had no more obstacles, and he drove straight in, used his ability to tear a hole in the nuclear submarine, and strode in. As for Rorschach, he walked towards the other mutants of the Hellfire Club. Those mutants immediately felt their anus tightened and felt great tension. Ha! Seeing this, the bald man shouted loudly and suddenly shot a Hulk blast at Rorschach. Boom! Boom! 2 huge waves exploded from the sea behind the bald man and shot towards Rorschach. It's just a pity that Rorschach is now a real steel man. This level of attack is not even enough for Rorschach to take seriously. Boom! Rorschach stepped on the ground with both feet, and he was ejected forward like a cannonball, smashing directly into the huge wave. Splash! The next moment, water splashed, but it was Rorschach's body, rushing out from the other side of the huge wave. He fell heavily in front of the bald man. The bald man's face changed. His attack was so powerful that he could easily overturn a car, but it had no effect on this Oriental man at all. This man actually used his body to withstand his attack. Xiao's information was correct, this man's body was really abnormal. Boom! Just as those thoughts flashed through his mind, the bald man felt a strong force hitting him, and then he flew backwards. Crack! At the same time, the sound of broken bones also rang. So fast. This was the last thought that flashed through the bald man's mind. Before he could react, he felt that Rorschach's body left a residual image. Then he flew away. He didn't even see how Rorschach threw a punch. And then, nothing happened. The bald man's eyes went black and he lost consciousness completely. He didn't even know that his body fell from the sky like a dead dog. Gudong! The braided man couldn't help swallowing his saliva and felt as panicked as an old dog. Except for Nicholas, who flew in the air and didn't know where he went, all the friends who fought side by side were killed as soon as they turned around. He was the only one left. This guy from the east is much more powerful than the legend. You won't bully the minority with more, right? You need to show some martial ethics. Seeing Rorschach clapping his hands and starting to take steps again nonchalantly, the braided man was really not calm at all. He actually yelled at Rorschach at the top of his lungs. Little did they know that Rorschach actually had no intention of taking action against the braided man. Among all the mutants on the Black Emperor's side, this braided man is considered the weakest, and his ability is extremely limited in face-to-face combat, rather than a large-scale attack like the Windy Man or the Bald Man. Even after fighting Darwin for so long, he didn't even win Darwin. This kind of ant-like opponent posed no threat to Rorschach, so Rorschach didn't bother to pay attention to it. Anyway, Rorschach's mission is to kill Xiao, not to kill all Xiao's people. It would be nice to leave such an insignificant role to others. He can't do everything by himself. Rorschach ignored the braided man at all, and walked straight into the nuclear submarine along the big hole that Eric tore open. Sure enough, they didn't stop you. A voice suddenly sounded. But inside the nuclear submarine, there was actually a guy wearing a gas mask, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, and slowly opening his mouth to Rorschach. Judging from his appearance, he seemed to be waiting for Rorschach. The Black Emperor actually arranged a backup plan. Luo Sha was slightly surprised, but after thinking about it carefully, he felt it was reasonable. It's even strange that there is no backup plan. The last time a group of people in Manhattan arranged a large number of people, they failed miserably. How could they only arrange a few people outside this time? Of course, the transparent man is indeed a trump card. If Rorschach did not have super hearing, the opponent might really be able to kill Rorschach. But at such a critical moment, Xiao only arranged such a trump card, which was a bit unsafe no matter how you looked at it. Now it seems that this guy wearing a gas mask should be the second trump card arranged by the other party. You're so careless. Before, I was only paying attention to the situation on the beach outside, but ignored that there might be other people hiding in the nuclear submarine. Rorschach actually didn't even notice the masked man's presence. And now, the masked man is standing here perfectly, but Eric is not there. Rorschach looked around hurriedly to check the surrounding situation. He's fine, the guy who went in before. The masked man knew what Rorschach was worried about, so he explained to Rorschach, Xiao seems to have different expectations for him. Rorschach would not listen to the masked man. He opened up his clairvoyance ability, and sure enough, he quickly discovered Eric and Xiao in the secret room at one end of the nuclear submarine. At this moment, Eric is being ravaged as if he were his third grandson. To be honest, Xiao's ability is really abnormal, and it is impossible to kill the opponent with Eric. Seeing that Eric was fine, Rorschach was relieved. He didn't mean any nonsense, and looked at the masked man in front of him with a sneer. His eyes immediately turned red. He planned to send this masked man to the west with a direct heat ray. However, the masked man was well prepared. At this moment, he took off the gas mask on his face and let out a breath of air. A mouthful of fresh, hot, green gas. There is no doubt that those gases must be poisonous gases. The ultimate backup prepared by the Black Emperor specifically for Rorschach is actually Hanzo the Sancho fish. The green poisonous gas was like green mist in the blink of an eye, filling the entire scene and shrouding Rorschach's entire body. The masked man couldn't help but smile coldly. You must be Xiao's pet peeve, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to release me. No matter how powerful you are doomed. No one can resist my poisonous energy. Forehead. The masked man stopped abruptly in the middle of his words, because Rorschach directly shot a heat ray on the masked man's body. It directly shot a big hole in the masked man's chest. Boom! The huge force knocked the mask away, and the masked man hit the wall behind him hard before falling down. Looking up, he saw Rorschach walking out of the green poisonous gas with a normal expression. Not to mention he was injured, he still looked calm, with a rosy complexion. The poisonous gas that can poison a person to death by causing internal organ ulcers in just a few seconds actually has no impact on the other person at all. How so? This kind of thing. How is it possible? His eyes widened, and after he murmured these 2 words with great reluctance, the masked man tilted his head and fell completely to the ground. No breath. Xiao Ke really prepared a big gift for me. Luo Sha glanced at the masked man's body and couldn't help but sneer. Frankly speaking, this masked man is very, very powerful. If used properly, he can easily kill an entire team of X-Men by himself. Whether it's Charles, Eric, or anyone else, except maybe Darwin, everyone will be killed instantly. It's just that we are fighting in an open area now, and the masked man's abilities are greatly restricted, that's all. If the masked man was also in the hotel in Manhattan, it would be a disaster for everyone. From the perspective of He Huang and his friends, the masked man is indeed a super weapon to deal with Rorschach. But, for the same reason, He Huang and his friends will never know Rorschach's true strength. After all, to be honest, Rorschach's cheat is really a bit too much. After glancing at the masked man's body, Rorschach immediately retracted his gaze and began to walk towards the secret room at the front of the nuclear submarine with big strides. After walking about 20 meters along the long passage, Rorschach stopped in front of a wall. Swish! The heat ray shot out directly, forcibly cutting a square closed loop in the wall, and then punched out. A hole appeared in front of Rorschach. Behind the hole was a silver-colored enclosed space, and Xiao was pressing the embarrassed Eric against the wall. Hearing the noise, Xiao turned his head and looked at Luo Sha with a look of boundless coldness and solemnity. It's you again, they really couldn't stop you. I knew you would be a big worry for me. Xiao stared at Luo Sha with a solemn expression, and also had an undisguised murderous intent. This young man from the east was too troublesome and difficult to deal with, and he repeatedly caused trouble for him. This time, he had to get rid of him no matter what. Xiao, finally, we meet again. Rorschach seemed not to notice Xiao's cold and ruthless eyes. He smiled at Xiao and strode into the secret room. Rorschach, leave me alone, kill him. Eric struggled hard in Xiao's hands, but still stubbornly shouted at Rorschach. I have to say that I am still very sad and disappointed to hear this. Xiao shook his head and looked at Eric with a look of looking at a pitiful child. You are still obsessed with that insignificant emotional bond. They are just inferior people, and so is your mother. We are the future, we are the direction of human evolution. This is our era. I helped you become the real you, you should be grateful. Let Eric go, I will let you know what is the real direction of human evolution. Rorschach's voice sounded, and he said to Xiao lightly. That's right. Xiao then turned his attention back to Rorschach. Compared to Eric, you are more perfect, even more perfect than me to some extent, but unfortunately, I have to get rid of you. And you. Speaking of this, Xiao glanced at Eric condescendingly, you are just a ridiculous clown. Bang. Speaking of this, Xiao threw Eric aside casually as if he was throwing away garbage. In Xiao's eyes, Eric was simply an insignificant little character. Xiao even liked to appreciate Eric's despair and anger when he tried his best to get revenge but could not get what he wanted. It's Xiao. On the beach outside, Charles, who was concentrating on sensing Xiao, showed a touch of joy. Xiao seemed to be non-existent before, but not long after Rorschach entered, Charles suddenly sensed the other party's existence. But for some reason, Charles was only limited to sensing the other party's existence, that's all, but he could not read the other party's thoughts further. It's Rorschach. Charles was very excited. Before, Xiao completely blocked his perception, but the situation improved as soon as Rorschach entered. It was obvious that Rorschach had done something. Charles wanted to tell Rorschach that no matter what he had just done, he should continue to do it. But unfortunately, Charles, as always, had no effect on Rorschach. Charles had to settle for the next best thing and connect with Eric. Eric, I feel Xiao, did Rorschach do something? Charles asked Eric in Eric's consciousness. What did Rorschach do? Eric was stunned, and then recalled what had just happened. It seemed that what Rorschach had just done was to punch a big hole in this silver shining room, that's all. Could it be? It must be like this. Eric suddenly realized. This room was built so airtight, it must be to block Charles's perception. So when Rorschach broke the secret room, there was a flaw in that perfect shielding. So that's how it is. Eric suddenly became excited. There was no more nonsense. He immediately raised his hands and sensed all the metal around him. Controlling those metals, he began to hit them hard. Clang, clang. A burst of commotion suddenly sounded, but the silver, glass surface of the secret room was constantly destroyed by Eric. Eric, you finally have some brains, but all this is meaningless. Xiao shook his head and sneered. He naturally knew Eric's intention, but he had absorbed the energy of the nuclear submarine and was no longer afraid of his exposure. Swish. But what Xiao didn't expect was that when his attention was attracted by Eric, Rorschach shook his body and directly used his semi-sonic speed to take off Xiao's helmet in an instant. Xiao's ability is only to absorb energy, which has little effect on his own speed and reaction. In addition, his attention was attracted by Eric, so he didn't react to Rorschach's actions at all. I just felt the energy around me fluctuate, and my eyes blurred. Then I felt a chill on my forehead. Not good. Then Xiao's face changed drastically, and he began to rush towards Rorschach, trying to get his helmet back. Xiao knew that without the protection of the helmet, he would be dead. Well done, Rorschach. Eric's eyes lit up, and he shouted to Charles excitedly, Charles, now. In fact, Charles's mental power has always covered this place, and he didn't need Eric to remind him at all. He also sensed everything at the first time. Charles didn't have any more nonsense, and used his ability to freeze Xiao at the first time. Swish. Xiao turned into a statue just like that. Just stretched out his hand, took a step, and kept this posture motionless, as if the pause button was pressed. Rorschach, thank you. Eric thanked Rorschach, and then walked directly in front of Xiao, staring at Xiao with his eyes. His eyes were complicated. Xiao, finally, we have reached this point. Eric's eyes began to become cold, and his face showed an undisguised murderous intent. I know you can hear it, so I hope you know that I agree with everything you say. We are indeed the future of mankind. But unfortunately, you killed my mother. At this point, Eric planned to kill Xiao directly. But suddenly, Eric found that he couldn't move. It turned out that Charles used his ability to interfere with Eric's actions. Eric, listen to me carefully. Killing Xiao will not make you feel calm. It will only make your hands stained with blood, and you will never be able to clean it for the rest of your life. Charles began to brainwash Eric frantically. Charles, not now. Get out of my brain. Don't get in my way. Eric yelled desperately, trying desperately to get rid of Charles's control. Eric, control your anger, don't let anger control you. You don't want to be that kind of person, believe me. Shut up, don't get in my way, Charles. Eric was almost furious. This kind of behavior, when the enemy was right in front of him and he could kill him with a small coin, but he was stopped by his teammates, was really too aggrieved. Eric, tisk. Just when Eric and Charles were arguing fiercely, Rorschach shot a heat ray directly over, and shot 2 holes in Xiao's head at once. Ah, Charles, who was connected to Xiao's spirit, also felt the excruciating pain from Xiao at this moment. He couldn't help but let out a scream. Rorschach. No, Charles's face was twisted in pain, and he couldn't help but let out such a loud cry. At this moment, he didn't understand that it was Rorschach who killed Xiao. Charles had always known that Eric's lifelong pursuit was to kill Xiao, so he only paid attention to Eric from beginning to end. But he didn't expect that at the critical moment, it was Rorschach who ruthlessly killed Xiao. Charles can be said to be very sad, very disappointed, and very angry. You know, Charles has always had great hopes for Rorschach. Because Rorschach is different from Eric, he is not as radical and extreme as Eric. But now, Rorschach did something as extreme as Eric. Charles, what's wrong? Mora on the side saw Charles like this and couldn't help asking. Raven and Hank also looked over with concern. Xiao is dead. Rorschach killed him. Charles said weakly to several people, I didn't expect that Rorschach would do this in the end. Charles, is there anything wrong with this? Shouldn't people like Xiao die? Raven saw that Charles seemed very dissatisfied with Rorschach's approach, so she couldn't help but question. Xiao, who was extremely evil, deserved to die. Raven, why do you think so? Charles felt more and more that his heart was hit hard. He couldn't think that the closest person who grew up with him would not support him at such a critical moment. Charles, your tolerance is wrong this time. Raven said so, insisting on her own opinion. Mora, Hank. Charles looked at the other 2 people around him again, but saw that Mora and Hank didn't say much. Obviously, they didn't agree with Charles's non-killing concept. In any case, Xiao should be handed over to the CIA for processing. Mora thought about it and just gave such an answer. Frankly speaking, deep down in her heart, Mora felt that it was not too much for Xiao to die 10,000 times, and Charles's concept of not killing was simply a joke. But as a CIA agent, Mora did not agree with the behavior of privately executing the main culprit when the main culprit could be arrested. But taking a step back, Rorschach was not a CIA member at all. Mission completed. Congratulations to the host for obtaining 2,000 origin points. The host has surplus origin points detected. Would you like to use them immediately for strengthening? When Charles was injured by Rorschach, Rorschach in the nuclear submarine felt excited. Because he received a prompt from the system. The reward of 2,000 origin points has arrived. But there is no need to rush to strengthen or anything like that. Now is not the right time. Rorschach, you killed Xiao. Eric's voice sounded beside him, interrupting Rorschach's thoughts. But Eric, who had regained his freedom, just looked at Xiao's body on the ground, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed with emotions and murmured to Rorschach. The great enemy he had been pursuing to kill all his life was finally killed. But the one who did it was not him. Although it was a bit regrettable, Eric could not blame Rorschach for anything. On the contrary, Eric felt that he should thank Rorschach. It was Rorschach who helped him kill his great enemy, and this kind of thing, with Charles's intervention, was something he could not do. Yes, I killed Xiao. Rorschach nodded. Everything is over. No, everything has just begun. Eric said this meaningfully. He put aside those distracting thoughts at this time, looked at Rorschach with his eyes, and said to Rorschach, Rorschach, Charles's circle is not suitable for us. I plan to form my own circle. Join me, my brother. No, Eric, Charles's circle is not suitable for me, but your circle is not suitable for me either. Rorschach shook his head. I don't agree with both of your ideas at the same time, remember. This is really a pity. Eric said from the bottom of his heart, if you and I unite, we will definitely create a new era. But that's not the new era I want. Rorschach shrugged. Eric knew that although Rorschach was young, he was completely different from ordinary young people. Rorschach was a very mature and opinionated person. It was very difficult for him or Charles to change Rorschach's mind. So Eric didn't say much. But Rorschach, can you give me that? Eric pointed to the helmet in Rorschach's hand. Of course. Rorschach handed the helmet to Eric without hesitation. Then the two of them didn't say much, both walked out of the nuclear submarine and came to the beach outside. At this time, the war outside was over. The only remaining Hawkwing man and Braid man on the Black Emperor's side had been defeated and captured by the X-Men. Eric, Rorschach. After seeing the figures of Eric and Rorschach, all the mutants on the beach gathered around. Alex, let them go, the war is over. Eric saw the Eagle Wing Man and the Braid Man being held by the Devastators and spoke to them. But the Devastators did not listen to Eric's words, but instead looked at Charles with questioning eyes. Although for the mutants, Charles, Eric and Rorschach are in a position similar to that of a leader, Charles is the one that everyone really recognizes. After all, Xavier Manor belongs to Charles. Charles is also in charge of everything inside and outside. Similarly, their great transformation is also the result of Charles's training. Although Charles does not look as strong as Eric, his prestige in the hearts of mutants is not lower than Eric. As for Rorschach, it is another situation. Because Rorschach is the same age as them, they have more respect and admiration for Rorschach, and regard Rorschach as an idol to chase after. Seeing that the Devastators did not immediately obey his words, Eric did not care. He continued to speak to the mutants at the scene in a deep voice. Xiao is dead, but our enemies are still there. Our real enemies are right there. Eric pointed to the fleets on the sea not far away, and his voice was so sonorous and powerful, I can sense their guns moving under the water, and their cannons are pointing at us. They are our enemies. Beautiful people. Big bear people, all mankind. They are united because of the fear of the unknown. The Neanderthals are afraid, my fellow mutants. Eric gave a very persuasive mobilization speech to all the mutants. The United States Department of Defense. The round table, which symbolizes the highest power, is filled with bigwigs from various departments, including the military, the CIA, the Central Bureau of Investigation, and so on. Each of them is a big shot who can shake the whole country 3 times with a stomp of his feet. Just now, These big shots held an emergency meeting and reached a consensus. The Great Bear Country agrees with our idea. Let's launch a joint attack on the mutants, so that we can end this threat forever. The Minister of Defense announced the conclusion of the meeting to everyone. No one expected that the US-Soviet dispute, which everyone was worried about, would suddenly appear a group of people with various terrible abilities, mutants. Things of the level of nuclear submarines can be controlled by a single person. This is simply terrible. Even more than that, according to the intelligence from the front, those people can fly, can launch powerful shock waves, can control waves, hurricanes, and so on. Faced with these mutants who are beyond common sense and incredibly powerful, everyone is afraid. Terrified. Their weapons will no longer be useful in front of such a group, and their powerful ships and guns will also appear so fragile. The existence of such a group is beyond their control. For such an uncontrollable dangerous group, it is natural to get rid of it directly to feel at ease. At this moment, the two superpowers, which were originally in a hostile relationship, reached a tacit agreement. I have another agent there. The CIA director next to the Minister of Defense whispered to the Minister of Defense at this time. It's just an agent. She is one of our very good agents. She is just collateral damage. ... Eric's words made the atmosphere on the scene suddenly become depressed and heavy. Before this, what everyone considered and paid attention to was just dealing with Xiao, that's all, and they didn't think so much. But now, Eric put this cruel fact in front of them. The mutants subconsciously looked at the fleet on the sea, and actually saw that the warships were moving their barrels towards them. Everyone's face was extremely ugly. At the same time, it was very uncomfortable. These people were willing to risk being killed by the Black Emperor to rush over, for what? Isn't it to save the world? To protect these people from the Black Emperor's murderous hands. In the end, the people they protected turned against them. Nothing is more unacceptable than this. Charles, tell me I'm wrong. Eric's voice sounded, and he said to Charles on the side. Charles put his hand on his temple and sensed everyone on the two fleets. His face also became extremely ugly. Because what Eric said was true. There was not even a bit of exaggeration. The highest commanders of the two countries received orders from the upper levels of both sides to join hands and eliminate all mutants. Mora. Charles immediately shouted to Mora on the side. Mora understood. She was the only official figure in this operation, and no one else could negotiate with the upper level except her. Mora didn't say anything and immediately ran into the Blackbird fighter and contacted the upper level. Fleet Commander, this is Team XB-70, please answer. The beach is safe. Request to cancel the attack. Please answer if you hear me. Request to cancel the attack. However, no one responded in the receiver, and the other party directly interrupted the communication. Mora showed a look of despair. Mora. When Mora turned back, everyone's eyes were all on Mora. How much everyone hoped that Mora could bring them good news. However, Mora shook his head in despair. Swish. The hearts of all the mutants at the scene sank. The people they were trying to protect at the cost of their lives actually planned to kill them. Fire! Fire! At this moment, the highest commanders of the two fleets issued attack orders to their respective fleets almost at the same time. Boom boom boom. Boom boom boom. Missiles were fired at the mutants on the beach one after another. There were so many missiles, so dense that they almost covered the sky and even the sky above them. All the mutants' pupils shrank, and they were extremely nervous, and their hearts almost jumped out. With such dense missiles, they couldn't survive even if they had great abilities. Only Rorschach was still calm. He had Magneto on his side, so what was there to be afraid of? Did these mutants ignore the fact that Magneto could control metal because of their great nervousness? And which of the missile warheads that almost covered the sky didn't have metal? In fact, Rorschach was really a little curious. He felt that no matter who gave the highest order to attack, he felt that the other party's brain might be a little abnormal. Eric raised the nuclear submarine with one hand, and the noise was so loud that Rorschach didn't believe that the people on the fleet didn't see it. Rorschach didn't believe that the people on the fleet didn't know that there was metal in the missile. Then, combining these two situations, wouldn't it be tantamount to seeking death to launch missiles at Eric? Whoosh whoosh whoosh. As the missiles approached, the dull sound of breaking through the air became louder and louder, making people more and more depressed. The warheads also continued to enlarge in the pupils of the crowd. Finally, they came to their heads. However, at this critical moment, Eric calmly stretched out his hand to the warheads. The ability was activated. All the nuclear warheads seemed to be caught by an invisible big hand, and they were all frozen in the air. Ha! The mutants couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. God, how is it possible? The people on the two fleets saw this scene, and they almost stared out their eyes, shocked to the extreme. Is this something that humans can do? The worldview and cognitive system they had built for a long time collapsed in an instant. That's not all. After Eric had fixed the missiles, he did not sit idle. He just twisted his fist slightly. All the missile warheads suspended in the air turned around, pointed at the fleet on the sea. Eric, don't. Charles's face changed drastically, and he couldn't help but yell at Eric. But Eric seemed not to hear it, and continued to control the warheads and attack the fleet. Eric, stop it. Charles saw that the situation was extremely critical, so he didn't care about anything else. He yelled and rushed towards Eric. He planned to throw Eric to the ground and stop him. Whoosh! But at this time, Charles felt that his eyes were blurred, and there was already a person in front of him, blocking Charles's way. Charles's face suddenly became ugly. Rorschach, please, please don't stop me. There is no doubt that the person who stopped Charles was naturally Rorschach. Facing Charles's almost pleading eyes, Rorschach shook his head. Sorry, Charles, but I can't let you go. This time I agree with Eric, those people deserve to die. We didn't do anything wrong, we even saved them, but they wanted to kill us. I will not be soft on those who want to kill me. Rorschach, Eric, there are thousands of people on those ships, they just follow orders. That's not their intention. Charles roared at Rorschach and Eric. This is the only thing he can do now. Facing Rorschach's monster-like power, Charles couldn't break free from the opponent's obstruction, but now these two people can completely restrain his ability. This makes Charles helpless. Stop them. Alex, Sean, Darwin, stop Eric. Mora, stop Eric. Seeing that the warheads are getting closer and closer to the fleets, Charles can only hope for others. But the destroyer, the siren and Darwin are all confused and at a loss at this moment. Charles, Eric and Rorschach have always been the backbone of everyone. A series of actions can be said to be led by these three people, and these three people have never had any disagreements. However, now, the three leaders have begun to fight among themselves. Especially Eric and Rorschach are against Charles together, which makes the mutants more and more at a loss. They don't know whether they should help Charles or let him go. Of course, they also have to face another more serious problem. Even if they want to help Charles, they are afraid that they can't do anything. Neither Rorschach nor Eric can deal with them. Only Mora, she firmly supports Charles, suddenly took out the gun and pulled the trigger at Eric. Bang, bang, bang. Several bullets were fired at Eric in succession. But for Eric, who can control the magnetic field, it has no effect at all. Eric waved his hands directly and bounced all the bullets fired by Mora to the side. Whoosh! One of the bullets actually flew towards Charles again. This made Rorschach quite speechless. Charles's position, this time, should be different from the original work. Unexpectedly, he still couldn't avoid this bullet. But thinking about it again, the two of them were standing next to Eric, and it was not strange to be hit by Eric's random stray bullets. Rorschach's current strength is no longer the same as before. His motion capture, his reaction speed, and all aspects have been greatly improved. So he just stretched out his hand and easily took the bullet that was shot at Charles. This time, Charles was spared the fate of sitting in a wheelchair. And Mora's quick attack quickly used up all the bullets in her magazine, and Eric casually waved his hand and controlled the metal on her body to bounce Mora away. At this time, Eric began to continue to control the missile warhead to fly towards the fleet in the distance. Shit, this is too crazy, I'm sorry, Eric. At this critical moment, the destroyer finally made a decision. He took a step forward and was about to attack Eric. Swish! But the next second, Rorschach's two heat rays shot directly over. Shot on the beach at the feet of the destroyer, shooting 2 holes in it. Kill him. The siren also gritted his teeth at this time, opened his mouth and fired a sound wave attack at Eric. Whoosh! But the next moment, the siren's eyes suddenly blurred, and it was Rorschach who appeared in front of the siren like a ghost, stretched out his hand and pressed the siren's mouth. He pressed the sound wave back. Dude, this is wrong. Darwin shook his head repeatedly, but did not make a move. He knew that he could not fight Rorschach at all. What's more, it's too late now. Boom boom boom. Boom boom boom. The large number of warheads have all bombed the fleet in the distance. The continuous explosions sounded one after another, and one mushroom cloud after another continued to explode. The blazing flames, like the breath of the devil, engulfed everything. The fleets of the United States and the Soviet Union were blown to pieces by the dense warheads and completely turned into slag. Eric, what did you do? Charles's voice trembled, his face was ashen. He was so weak that he couldn't even stand up, and he sat down on the ground. It was as if the sky had fallen. The mutants used missiles to destroy the fleets of the United States and the Great Bear. Will there really be a place for mutants in human society in the future? Eric and Rorschach, this is pushing the mutants to a place of no return. At this moment, Charles's heart can be said to be bleeding, and he is extremely heartbroken. Charles, my friend, I'm sorry, but I have to do this. Eric glanced at Charles, who was limp on the beach, and said to him, "Friends, sorry, I don't think we are." Charles stared at Eric with his eyes wide open and shook his head. Charles felt that he could not forgive what Eric did now, which was completely beyond his bottom line. Charles, I have always wanted to stand on the same line with you. I want to unite our brothers and sisters. I want us to protect each other and keep each other warm. All our mutant brothers and sisters, unite together. Fight our enemies together. Charles, I hope we are like-minded, but unfortunately, we are not. When Eric said this, he looked at Rorschach, and Rorschach, I don't think we are as different as you say. Eric, I support your decision this time, just because they tried to kill us, that's all. Rorschach shrugged, yes, this time, at this moment, they are my enemies, but other ordinary people may not be to me. If they don't come to provoke me, I don't bother to pay attention to them. This is the biggest difference between you and me. No, Rorschach, they are our enemies, they must be our enemies. Doesn't what happened today teach you a lesson? The two parties that were originally hostile to each other, after seeing our abilities, they all joined hands. Doesn't this explain the problem? When the world sees our abilities, what do you think they will do? Eric, they are just scared. Besides, people making foolish decisions at the moment does not mean they will do so for the rest of their lives. Charles, Eric and Rorschach each expressed their own opinions. At this moment, the differences in their philosophies were fully revealed. Charles was too idealistic and had unrealistic and beautiful fantasies about everything. Eric seemed a little extreme, always speculating on everything with the worst malice. Rorschach, as for him, just neutralize these two people. Charles, just keep holding on to your unrealistic fantasy. Eric was too lazy to say anything more to Charles. He spoke to the mutants at the scene. Charles's circle is not suitable for me, so I want to form my own circle. A circle that truly protects and unites our mutant brothers and sisters. Who will join me? The mutants at the scene were in a dilemma. They looked at each other, each of them was overwhelmed and even a little at a loss. How did things develop to this point? How did the big family in Xavier Manor begin to split? Especially Charles, his mouth twitched uncontrollably, because of the great pain. From the day he rescued Eric, he and Eric fought side by side, supported each other, grew up together, and had already formed a very deep friendship. Although he was extremely sad about Eric's missile launch, he was still greatly shocked when Eric really cut off his friendship with him. But Charles did not speak to keep Eric. Like Eric, he knew that the two sides had very different ideas and neither could convince the other. Before, Charles could deliberately ignore these problems, but now, with such a big thing happening, Charles could no longer do it. Although he was unwilling and heartbroken, Charles had to recognize the fact that he and Eric were destined to part ways. Charles, I'm sorry, but I have to leave too. Rorschach also spoke at this time and said to Charles, the most important reason why he stayed in Xavier Manor was to be able to do some tasks and improve his strength. But now the early boss Shaw has been killed, and the Vietnam War is coming. The mutants will be forced to go to the battlefield, and Professor X will usher in a period of decline. Until Wolverine from the future came through. In this case, it is obviously inappropriate to continue staying in Xavier Manor. And Rorschach's current strength can be regarded as a foothold in this world, and he can't be confined to such a small circle as the X-Men for his whole life. It's time to leave. The corners of Charles's mouth twitched again. Eric is leaving, and Rorschach is leaving now. 3 brothers and comrades who used to fight together closely, are now going to go their separate ways. It is impossible for Charles to say that he is not sad. But just as Charles knows Eric, Charles also knows Rorschach. He knows that once Rorschach makes a decision, he will not change it. And Rorschach helped Eric kill so many people, and Charles didn't know how to face Rorschach in the future. So Charles still didn't say much. Rorschach, are you leaving too? The siren looked at Rorschach a little at a loss and shouted. Eric and Rorschach are gone, and the original big family has completely fallen apart. Charles, Eric, everyone, the time I spent with you is a wonderful memory for me, and I will never forget it. But all good things must come to an end. I have to go, but this does not mean that I am done with you all. If I have a chance in the future, I will come to see you. Rorschach said to everyone with a smile, of course, if any of you are willing to leave with me, I welcome you. The mutants at the scene were in a dilemma, which meant that they would face 3 choices next: follow Eric, follow Rorschach, or stay and continue to follow Charles. The atmosphere at the scene began to become a little subtle. The mutants looked at each other and began to think about this issue carefully. The first to make a choice were the Eagle Wing Man and the Braid Man. They were Xiao's confidants, and Eric's style of doing things was very similar to Xiao's, and even the words just now showed that his ideas were highly consistent with Xiao's. As for strength, not to mention, Xiao's death is the best explanation. This is a person worthy of their following. The 2 walked towards Eric first. None of the mutants on Charles's side stopped Hawkwing and the others. The grudge between them had long ceased to exist with Xiao's death. Not to mention, the X-Men were facing a big split now, so who would care about Hawkwing and the others? Everyone was thinking about whether to stay or go. Rorschach, I'll go with you. Soon, a voice sounded, and it was Hank who stood up firmly and stated his position. Rorschach's face showed a very relieved smile. Hank usually doesn't talk much, except for doing scientific research. He is a complete scientific research geek. But Rorschach actually thinks highly of Hank, who is a rare talent in the Marvel world. Rorschach even thinks that to some extent he is no worse than Tony Stark, not to mention the Blackbird fighter brainwave enhancer. Hank is definitely far better than Iron Man in biomedicine. Sorry, Charles. Hank turned his head and said to Charles with a hint of apology. No, you don't have to, Hank. Charles shook his head. Raven, don't hide yourself. Eric shouted to Raven at this time, and stretched out his hand to Raven, inviting Raven. Raven's face flashed with a struggle, but in the end, she faced Charles and said sorry to him as well. Charles was even more heartbroken. Raven was completely different from other mutants. This was the family that Charles had grown up with. Unexpectedly, even this family member was going to leave him now. Raven, I know you will leave. That's what you want, Charles said to Raven with a complicated expression. Charles, you promised me not to read my thoughts. I promised you a lot of things, but I'm afraid I can't fulfill them all. Charles, take care. After saying goodbye to Charles, Raven also began to leave the X-Men team and walked towards the distant beach. Eric couldn't help but smile. He didn't make a mistake. Raven was really different from Charles. Sorry, Eric, but I didn't choose you. But then, Raven stopped and said to Eric seriously. The smile on Eric's mouth froze slightly. Then he saw Raven turn a corner and walk towards Rorschach. To be honest, Rorschach was a little surprised at first to see that Raven didn't choose Eric but chose himself. But after thinking about it carefully, he felt that it was reasonable. Although Raven grew up with Charles, she did not agree with Charles's ideas, which is beyond doubt, so in the original work, Raven would leave with Eric. But in fact, Raven also did not agree with Eric's ideas, at least not completely. This is why Raven left Eric again just a few years after leaving with Eric and chose to work alone. Eric is indeed a bit too extreme. Originally, Raven had no choice, but now, she has a better choice. A person who is not as idealistic as Charles, but not as extreme as Eric. Raven walked to Rorschach unswervingly and stood with Hank. As for the remaining 3 people, the Destroyer, the Siren and Darwin, they looked at each other for a few times, and finally did not move their feet, but chose to stay. Everyone, we will meet again in the mountains and rivers, goodbye. Rorschach greeted Charles and Eric, and without saying any more nonsense, he turned around and left with Hank and Raven. Charles, goodbye. Eric also said hello to Charles, and left without looking back with the Eagle Wingman and the Dreadlock Man. Only Charles, Mora and the Ravager were left, looking melancholy. Ministry of National Defense. Our fleet has lost contact. A Navy general of the military said solemnly to several bigwigs at the round table. All the bigwigs' faces also became ugly. They just ordered the fleet to attack the mutants, but in a blink of an eye, their fleet lost contact. This is not a phone call. Losing contact only means that the call is interrupted. In this case, there is only one possibility for losing contact. The people on their fleet may have encountered an accident. Something happened to the fleet. What about the Great Bear Country? The Minister of Defense asked the Navy general in a deep voice. Like us, they have also lost contact. The Navy general replied in a deep voice. The brows of the senior officials frowned immediately, and they all had an extremely bad feeling in their hearts. The US and Soviet fleets lost contact at the same time. What happened? And were the mutants eliminated? If it were normal, the firepower carried by the US and Soviet fleets would be enough to deal with just a few mortals and crush them to ashes 100 times. But now, the fleet has completely lost contact. This kind of thing is simply puzzling. Cuban Beach. Hank, Raven, please wait a moment. Not long after leaving Charles and the others, Rorschach suddenly called Hank and Raven. Rorschach, what's wrong? Raven looked at Rorschach a little strangely and asked. Hank just adjusted his glasses and didn't ask much. Nothing, my ability seems to have become stronger in the previous battle with Shao. Rorschach said this to Raven and Hank. Stronger again. Both Raven and Hank were speechless, and it can be said that they were severely stimulated. Rorschach was already ridiculously strong, and he started to get stronger again. Do you still want to let others live? But no matter what, this is also a good thing. Both of them couldn't help showing excitement on their faces. Rorschach didn't say anything nonsense and directly entered the system panel. Host, Rorschach, age, 16 years old. Speed, 164.4 meters per second. Strength, 127.2 tons. Physique, 308. Average value of adult healthy men 10. Mental strength, 271. Average value of adult healthy men 10. Current template. Homelander unlock progress 15%. Abilities. Perspective primary, super hearing primary, heat ray primary, flight unlocked. Origin point, 2026 points. Seeing the number, 2026, at the origin point, Rorschach couldn't help but feel excited. He has never been so rich. This is a huge sum of money. The host has surplus origin points. Would you like to use them immediately to strengthen? The system sent this prompt again. This time, Luo Sha naturally had no questions. Strengthen. Congratulations to the host, the Homelander template is unlocked by 35%. 35%. Rorschach could not hold back his excitement. The progress of this unlocking was the largest in history, and Rorschach was very satisfied. Host, Rorschach, age, 16 years old. Speed, 378.2 meters per second. Strength, 341 tons. Physique, 510. Average value of healthy adult males 10. Mental strength, 581. Average value of healthy adult males 10. Current template. Homelander unlocking progress 35%. Abilities. Perspective intermediate, super hearing intermediate, heat ray intermediate, flight unlocked. Origin points, 26 points. Strength surge. Rorschach is a good guy, and this wave of enhancement can be regarded as a real surge in strength. His speed directly exceeded the speed of sound from semisonic, and his strength became more than 300 tons. His physique and mental strength have more than doubled. In addition, the abilities of perspective, super hearing, heat rays, etc. have also been greatly improved, from the original elementary to the intermediate level. A great harvest. This wave can really be called a great harvest. The host has unlocked 30% of the progress and can unlock the flying ability. Do you want to unlock it? The above is just the beginning. Luo Sha did not expect that he would hear such a prompt again in his mind. Has the flying ability that he has been thinking about finally arrived? Luo Sha's breathing became a little hurried. How could he hesitate at all? Unlock. Swish. In an instant, Luo Sha felt that his body had undergone some inexplicable changes. But he felt very clearly that he could really fly. Chapter 91. Rorschach, how are you? There was a voice next to her, and she saw Ruiwen looking at Luo Sha with concern. Hank was also staring directly at the side. I'm fine. Luo Sha smiled so brightly. Actually, I felt it carefully just now, and I seem to have awakened a new ability. Awakened again. Raven and Hank no longer knew what to say. Rorschach, if you keep hanging up, there will really be no end to it, right? And how long has it been since the last time I awakened the ability of Heat Ray? Raven even had the illusion that they were fake mutants and Rorschach was the real mutant. Otherwise, why would the gap between the two sides be so huge? Wait a moment. Ruiwen suddenly remembered another thing. It seems that the last time Rorschach awakened his heat ray, it was after his battle with Xiao at the CIA base. And this time he awakened his new ability, seemingly after the battle with Xiao. Isn't this guy Xiao the lucky boy of Rorschach? Really, Rorschach, this is really cool. I wonder what new abilities you have awakened. Hank couldn't help but look at Rorschach expectantly and asked. Flight. Rorschach couldn't help but spit out these two words with a hint of pride. Flight. Rorschach, you can fly. Isn't this too exaggerated? Both Raven and Hank couldn't help but widen their eyes and screamed. That's flying. Even for mutants, this ability is very rare. What's more, Rorschach is different from the guy they just fought with. Rorschach doesn't have any wings. Rorschach, I admit that I am a little jealous. I feel that you are God's biological son, and we are just adopted. Raven looked at Luo Sha with envy and jealousy and said, I believe Charles and the others will definitely. Hank was still in high spirits, but halfway through speaking, he suddenly realized that the situation was different now, and couldn't help but shut his mouth. That's right, Hank, if Charles and the others know about it, they will definitely be happy for me. Rorschach spoke for Hank what he had not finished. Yes, they will. Raven nodded heavily. A look of confusion flashed across her face. She actually couldn't let go of Charles and Eric, but they had to face a cruel fact. They could never go back to the past. Riven, Hank, I awakened this ability very quickly. You two hold me tight. Rorschach reached out to Raven and Hank at this time. The two of them understood what Rorschach meant. They walked to both sides of Rorschach, one on the left and the other on the right, and hugged him tightly. Whoosh! Then they felt their eyes flash, and as soon as their bodies became light, they rose up from the ground and were carried by Rorschach to fly in the air. Two fleets here have just turned into dust. Both the beautiful country and the Big Bear country will come over to investigate as soon as possible. Rorschach was right, the opponent's flight did awaken in time and could take them away as soon as possible. Otherwise it will be very troublesome if the delay continues. Wow, it's really flying. Ho ho, this feels so good. Feeling the airflow flying around them, overlooking the increasingly smaller land beneath their feet, both Raven and Hank couldn't help shouting in excitement. Because there was no biological force field, Rorschach deliberately slowed down. In addition, Raven and Hank are both mutants, and their physical fitness is more or less stronger than ordinary people. So they didn't feel any discomfort. Instead, you can still have the time to experience the wonderful feeling of flying at high altitudes. But this is just the beginning. Because Rorschach held them like that and flew for nearly 4 hours before finally landing in a remote and uninhabited suburb of beautiful country. There's no way, it's so troublesome without a biological force field, he can't fly too fast. After maintaining the same posture for such a long time, they were already tired of looking at the scenery, and even their arms felt sore and numb. If Rorschach hadn't been strong enough to hold them firmly, they might have fallen from the sky long ago. No, I'm exhausted. My whole body is sore and numb, and I can't even stand still. Raven immediately started to pant while holding on to a wall next to her. Being carried while flying is really a physical job. Ordinary people really wouldn't be able to do it. I swear, I will never do this again. Hank's face didn't look very good either. He felt that his back was sore and his head was dizzy, as if he was hungover. The second time. Haha, Hank, I have to sell tickets next time. Rorschach was calm and composed, and said teasingly to Hank. It has to be said that the physical fitness of the 35% template is good. He, who serves as a flying tool, only feels a little tired, that's all. The two passengers couldn't stand it anymore. The gap shouldn't be too big. After repairing in place for more than 10 minutes, Raven and Hank finally breathed a sigh of relief. The two looked at each other at this time, and both saw a look of confusion in each other's eyes. When Cuba chose to follow Rorschach, they didn't think too much about it, but now, a question has emerged: where will they go? In an instant, the two lost their goals and direction. He even lost a place like Xavier Manor. A kind of emptiness and confusion struck the two of them. Where are we going next? Raven looked at Hank, then at Rorschach, and couldn't help but ask. Raven has grown up in Xavier Manor since she was a child. Now that she has chosen to leave, naturally she can never go back. I don't know either. Hank shook his head in confusion. The two couldn't help but look at Luo Sha. This is it. Meeting their gazes, Rorschach grinned. I really know a place. It seems it's time to take over the undead tribe that Dracula gave to Rorschach. Both Raven and Hank couldn't help showing a hint of excitement. But before that, let's find a place to eat. After Rorschach said this, both Raven and Hank felt their stomachs growling with hunger. They each shrugged and said nothing more. He and Rorschach took steps together and walked out along the path ahead. Raven, could you please change your appearance? However, seeing that Raven next to him still looked blue-skinned, Hank thought about it and said to her. Hank, Erica's right, you don't have to hide yourself. No, what happened in Cuba will soon shock the world. Mutants will usher in an embarrassing and severe period. Raven, at this time, I think it is best for us to keep a low profile. Raven was speechless. Yes, Hank makes sense, the ice age of mutants is coming. Hank was right. The destruction of the US and Soviet fleets in Cuba caused an uproar around the world, triggering a super shock that was no less than an 8-magnitude earthquake. All countries were dumbfounded when they received this news, and could not even believe the authenticity of the intelligence. After repeated confirmations, I was finally shocked and convinced that the incident was true. No way. Now we are in the Cold War period. The United States and the Soviet Union are the only two superpowers in the world. Every move of these two powers will have a profound impact on the world. Not to mention the Cuba confrontation, that could change the world structure and even trigger World War III. It can be said that the eyes of the whole world are paying close attention to this confrontation. Under such circumstances, how could it be possible to hide the fact that two fleets were destroyed? However, despite being shocked, this matter is full of mystery. Intelligence agencies in various countries have invested a lot of manpower in investigating, analyzing, and researching, trying to figure out what is going on. But unfortunately, nothing was found. No one knows why the fleets of the two most powerful countries were destroyed at the same time. That is simply impossible to happen. It's a mutant. It must be those mutants. Department of Defense. The Minister of Defense said in a very affirmative tone to all the big guys present. Other than that, it's impossible for anyone to easily wipe out the fleets of the two superpowers in the world. Unless it's a monster. The voice of the Minister of Defense was so sonorous and powerful. The fleet was all sunk. No, they were blown to ashes before they started sinking. No one survived. There are no mutants at all at the scene. We don't know where they went. We can't even be sure whether they are still alive. No one knows what happened. All our current conclusions are inferences. A military boss said this after pondering for a while. But it's a reasonable inference. The director of the CIA spoke at the side. We have received information that one of the mutants can lift a nuclear submarine from the bottom of the sea to the sky. Isn't it? That person can control metal. Since he can even lift a nuclear submarine, it will not be a problem for him to control all the missile warheads to attack the fleets of the two countries. The big guys at the scene couldn't help but nod secretly. This inference is indeed the most logical and possible inference. Everyone still agrees with it. Chief Hansen. At this time, the Secretary of Defense looked at the director of the CIA. Didn't your CIA set up a mutant department? They are the ones who went to Cuba this time, right? It should be them, Director Hansen said hesitantly. Should. The Minister of Defense suddenly became unhappy. It is a travesty that such an ambiguous word as should appear in the mouth of the head of an intelligence agency. The guy who can control metal, I know him. He is one of the original mutant team. He is a mutant with magnetic control. But I can't be sure if the others are from the previous mutant team, because Mora has been suspended, and she acted in private this time. Although he knew that this kind of thing was very embarrassing, Director Hansen still had to bite the bullet and come out. Thank you for saying she was a very good agent before. The Secretary of Defense looked at Director Hansen with a very sarcastic look. Well, maybe she's not that good, but now I think the only person we can count on is her. Director Hansen shrugged. Only Mora knew what happened at that time. What the? The Minister of Defense frowned and swore, when you contact that excellent agent, be sure to tell us as soon as possible. Director Hansen, we need intelligence on mutants. The military boss interrupted at this time, looking at Director Hansen with a serious face and said. Although the truth of the matter is still shrouded in mystery, the mutants group has completely attracted the attention of many big shots. Well, we have to wait until I contact Agent Mora. Director Hansen touched his nose to hide his embarrassment. He felt that the mutant team that Mora proposed to form was a complete mess and he didn't pay much attention to it. Later, not long after its establishment, the entire base was taken over, and he simply disbanded the organization. He really doesn't know who the specific members of that team are. This happened. Suddenly, all the breakthroughs were made by Agent Mora, who had been suspended before and was not loved by his grandmother and uncle. Xavier Manor, Devastator, Siren, and Darwin were sitting casually on a step, looking a little listless. The atmosphere at the scene also seemed very dull. After returning from Cuba, half of the people in the once bustling place were suddenly missing, which made them unable to adapt for a while. Shiete, why did this happen? Siren said very depressedly. However, no one could answer him. I hope Charles can cheer up as soon as possible. Darwin said so. Although Charles acted as if nothing had happened, everyone at the scene understood that Eric and Rorschach's departure still left Charles with deep scars. Several people subconsciously looked at Charles and Mora on the lawn in front, and couldn't help thinking, at this time, Mora was the only one who could comfort Charles. One day, the government will realize how lucky they are because Professor X is on their side. Mora said to Charles from the bottom of her heart. Everyone understands that with Eric's bombing, mutants and ordinary humans will usher in a sharp confrontation period. Many mutants have to be forced to stand in line. In this case, Charles still unswervingly chooses the side of ordinary humans, which really makes Mora very relieved. This man, she was not wrong. This is a person with a big picture view, not as extreme and narrow-minded as Eric. I plan to be a professor, maybe I will be bald in the future. Charles squeezed a dry laugh at Mora. Mora was really amused. I'm still on the side of the government, Mora. Charles then said to Mora in a serious tone, we are still government people, but we don't have a name. No, you have your own team. Mora shook her head, isn't that better? You are the X-Men. Haha, it sounds good, but Mora, hiding our identities is our first line of defense. Charles said to Mora in a serious tone again. Considering the future situation, the emergence of mutants now will only intensify the contradictions between them and ordinary people, causing greater conflicts. So Charles decided that mutants should keep a low profile. Especially what happened in Cuba. The truth must never be known to everyone, otherwise, there will really be a blood feud between mutants and ordinary humans. It can't be washed away. I know, Mora promised Charles heavily. Charles, no matter how others threaten me, I will not tell them where you are. Of course I know you won't. Charles said from the bottom of his heart, and then he kissed her directly. However, at this moment, Charles put his hand on his temple and activated his ability. Deleted all the memories about mutants in Mora's mind. In this way, what happened in Cuba will be buried in the darkness forever and will not be known by anyone. Charles certainly knows that the United States, the Soviet Union and other countries in the world are not fools, and they will certainly look at mutants with suspicion. But as long as there is no evidence, there will always be room for maneuver in the future, and it will not be considered a complete break. I just hope that Eric and Rorschach will not let me down. Mora, I'm sorry, but this is the best choice for you. Charles murmured in his heart again. He knew that even so, someone had to pay for the sinking of the Cuban fleet, and the anger of the two countries had to have an outlet. It is an indisputable fact that mutants will become this outlet, and Mora will be in a very difficult and dangerous situation in the middle. Drawing a clear line with mutants is indeed the best choice for Mora. 34th Street, New York. A majestic castle, although not as exaggerated in scale as Xavier Manor, but still enough to shock ordinary people, stands so proudly on the wide roadside. What is different from Xavier Manor is that this castle still exudes a very primitive atmosphere, which actually gives people a sense of sedimentation and heaviness of the years. Rorschach, is this the place you said you would settle down? Hank looked up at the endless castle, and his eyes almost popped out of his head. Rorschach, you are actually the same as Charles. You hide it really well. Raven also said dumbfounded. Even if this castle is not as big as Xavier Manor, with such a supermansion in a place like New York, Rorschach must have an extraordinary background. Fortunately, everyone still thought that Rorschach was just like them. Well, Hank adjusted his glasses on the side, and couldn't help but feel a little excited when he thought that he could still live in such a mansion after leaving Charles. It seems that there are a lot of trees planted here. She didn't notice it before, but now that Hank mentioned it, Raven did notice it. Good guy, if you look around, the entire castle is basically covered by the forest. There are quite a lot of trees planted, and they are planted in all the places that should be planted and in places that should not be planted. Moreover, those trees are still a few years old, and they are all very tall. If a large area is connected together, it can really be called blocking out the sky and the sun. It seems that the owner here must really like the feeling of nature. Raven laughed on the side and complained slightly, it's just a little bit, wouldn't they think it's a bit spooky? Spooky. What they want is spooky. Rorschach couldn't help but laugh in his heart. But Hank and Raven on the other side obviously misunderstood. Rorschach did not intend to live in this place, but to conquer the vampire tribe living in this castle. As for living here or whatever, forget it. It's dark all day long and you can't tell whether it's day or night. It's probably enough for 3 days to make you suffer from depression. Let's go and take you two to broaden your horizons. Rorschach greeted the two of them and began to stride towards the main entrance of the castle. I can't wait, Ruiwen said excitedly with her eyes shining. Although Hank didn't say much, there was a look of expectation on his face. Let me remind you in advance that the people living here are not human beings. Rorschach mysteriously said to Raven and Hank. Not human. Hank was stunned for a moment, then his voice suddenly rose, are they all mutants? As he spoke, Hank looked at Raven on the side with some confusion. Rorschach actually knows about another mutant gathering place. No, strictly speaking, they are not humans, they can only be a group of blood-sucking monsters. Rorschach tilted his head and thought for a while before making this conclusion. A blood-sucking monster. Raven and Hank looked at each other, and for a moment they didn't realize who Rorschach was talking about. Drop, drop. After ringing the doorbell, almost 5 minutes later, a man who hid himself completely in a robe, even wearing a hood and covering his face with a black scarf, appeared in front of several people. This is private property, please leave immediately. The man in black robe had no intention of communicating with Rorschach and the others, and directly drove them away in a ruthless manner. Private territory. Of course, this is my private territory. Rorschach nodded seriously. Man in black robe. Is this a lunatic? Where does this neurosis come from? Don't make me say it a second time, get out now. The man in black robe shouted angrily at Luo Sha. Laugh. Rorschach said nothing nonsense and shot a heat ray directly, hitting the arm of the man in black robe. Ah! The man in black robe staggered and almost fell to the ground. A heartbreaking pain hit him, causing him to cover his arm and scream in pain. Looking down hurriedly, the man in black robe saw that his arm had been severely burned. As a vampire, the unique super healing power is completely useless at this moment. The wound didn't get any better. Not only that, it was also rapidly destroying his body structure. Who are you? The man in black robe did not dare to show any slight to Luo Sha now. He stared at Luo Sha in shock and anger and asked. When we first met, You didn't know me, so I forgive your offense to me, but next time, be careful I make 2 holes in you. Luo Sha snorted coldly, then took out the ring and handed it to the other party. Give this thing to your top person in charge. The man in black robe didn't dare to be careless at all. He took the ring with a hint of doubt. But after looking at it carefully for a while, I couldn't see anything extraordinary about this thing. But even so, the man in black robe is not a fool, so he naturally knows that this ring must not be a mortal thing. The person in front of me also has a great background. It may also be related to their undead clan. Please wait a moment. Although he didn't quite understand Rorschach's intention, the black-robed man still responded timidly. God have mercy on him, he was really scared by Rorschach's heat ray. I only give you 5 minutes. If you exceed the time limit, you will bear the consequences. Rorschach didn't say much, but said coldly. The black-robed man trembled, his steps quickened a bit, and soon disappeared from the sight of several people. Raven and Hank then turned their puzzled eyes back to Rorschach. The two of them were confused and had no idea what was going on. The strangeness of the black-robed man and Rorschach's attitude towards him confused them. Rorschach, what's going on? Raven finally asked in confusion. To put it simply, there is a group of vampires living here. Yes, they are the things that live by sucking blood in the legend. Rorschach didn't keep it a secret anymore. He shrugged and said to the two. Vampire. Raven and Hank both couldn't help but widen their eyes. This legendary thing actually exists. This world is too crazy. Raven, Hank, this world is far more exciting than you think. You will see it slowly in the future. Rorschach saw the surprised look in their eyes, but couldn't help but smile meaningfully at them. This is the world of Marvel. What's a mere vampire? Not to mention the superhero era opened by Iron Man, just talking about the near future, Sentinel robots, Apocalypse, Debari people. There is a high probability that there will be Cybertronians. Not to mention the Kree and Skrulls. This world will officially enter an era of chaos. Tap tap tap, tap tap tap. Soon, a chaotic sound of footsteps came over. In the courtyard in front of him, a group of people wearing black suits, sunglasses, and holding parasols walked quickly towards Rorschach. The man in the lead had flowing shoulder-length hair, and a big middle part, just like Snape in Harry Potter. It has to be said that ordinary people can't handle this hairstyle at all. But the man in front of him matched this hairstyle perfectly, and this man's face. Rorschach accidentally glanced and found that Snape was very familiar, and then he immediately realized Snape's identity. Klein, the administrator of the vampire side in Underworld, is responsible for taking care of the daily activities of the vampires when the vampire elders are asleep. It seems that he is not a good person. He colluded with the werewolf leader Lucian, and was finally shot in the head by the vampire elder Marcus. His death was not tragic. Rorschach never expected that the undead tribe that Dracula asked him to take over was actually such a familiar tribe. No wonder. Rorschach felt so familiar with the story of the Hungarian Duke at that time. Isn't that the ancestor of vampires and werewolves in the Dark Knight series of movies? When these thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein had already walked over with a large number of people. He just stood by the iron fence of the gate, separated by several fences, and looked at Rorschach from a distance. After staring at Rorschach for a few seconds, he picked up the ring and looked at Rorschach and asked, "Is this ring yours?" "Of course," Rorschach said as a matter of course. "Please wear it," Klein said to Rorschach again in a deep voice, and then handed the ring to Rorschach. Rorschach shrugged, casually put the ring on his finger, and then spread his hands to Klein. "See." Klein's expression eased, and he casually told the people around him, "Open the door." Squeak. The two big iron doors were pushed open, and Klein made a gesture of invitation to Rorschach, "Please come in." "Let's go," Rorschach called out to Hank and Raven. Raven and Hank looked at each other, and they felt a little uneasy when they saw so many vampires around, and even felt a little chilly. But looking at the calm Rorschach, they felt a lot more at ease. With Rorschach here, what are these vampires? The group followed Rorschach and Klein and walked towards the castle. "Don't know what to call you." Klein's voice sounded, and he asked Rorschach expressionlessly. "Rorschach." Rorschach gave his name. "Mr. Rorschach, I can only make a preliminary identification of the ancestor's ring based on the records, but to really confirm it, we need the elders of our tribe. So, I can't confirm your supreme identity for the time being. Supreme. Rorschach felt a little speechless. This title sounded a bit too childish. But from Klein's words, he could draw a conclusion. It seems that the undead who were directly cursed by Dracula's ring should be the supreme among the undead. And most of the undead in the world are mostly transformed from those supremes. This may be why a supreme, like him, has such a high status among the undead. Of course, these are all Rorschach's guesses, but Rorschach feels that his guesses are still very likely to be correct. He didn't say much, just nodded lightly, indicating that he knew, that's all. At this time, Rorschach naturally wouldn't ask such a stupid question as what is the supreme. I have sent someone to notify our elders. The elders will come in person in about 30 minutes. In the meantime, I can only ask Mr. Rorschach to stay quietly in the reception room and not to move around casually. Since you have found us, it means you know who we are. I believe you can understand, right? Klein continued to speak to Rorschach with a cold face. Rorschach naturally did not take this to heart. He just asked curiously, which elder is in power in this century? According to the plot of the movie, this group of undead has 3 elders. One of the elders is in power, and the other 2 elders are asleep, rotating every century. Amelia. Rorschach thought about it, looked at Klein tentatively and asked. The timeline of Dark Knight takes place in the 21st century. At that time, Amelia was in power, and the other 2 elders, Victor and Marcus, were both asleep. Going forward, Amelia was probably in power at this time. Klein couldn't help but look at Rorschach with surprise. This person actually had such a deep understanding of their tribe, and some of his doubts about Rorschach were also dispelled. Of course, only a little. After all, no matter how you look at it, Rorschach is still not one of their undead. Being politely led to the reception room by a group of vampires, Klein also specially ordered someone to bring a few cups of coffee to Rorschach and others. But it must be said that the brewing method was quite rough. Sorry, we don't usually use these things. There are usually no guests here, you know, the ordinary guests. Even the coffee machine was bought by those ladies out of curiosity, so just make do with it. If there is anything, just tell Erica. Please excuse me. After greeting a few people, Klein left in a hurry. But he left a very revealing and female vampire at the scene. It made Raven and Hank uncomfortable. As for the coffee in front of them, they dared not drink it anyway. They are really vampires. Have you seen their teeth, Hank? Raven whispered and put her head in front of Hank, saying to Hank with curiosity and a little excitement. Hank quietly looked at the female vampire not far away, and nodded with a hint of excitement. Yes, each of them has that kind of teeth, and they have an indescribable smell on their bodies. Is there a smell? I didn't notice it, but they give people a very cold feeling. And their faces are very pale. Seeing how excited these 2 guys are, Rorschach couldn't help but shake his head and chuckle. Elder, someone is inside. After chatting with Raven and Hank for a while, Klein went back. Beside him, there was a woman who looked full of aristocratic temperament. There is no doubt that it was the vampire elder Amelia. Amelia's appearance in Night is extremely limited. She is just a background character, a super small supporting role. She was even bitten to death by a group of werewolves led by Lucian as soon as she appeared, and her blood was drained. She looked very unworthy. She even looked very weak. But in fact, Amelia's status in this vampire tribe is very high, second only to Marcus and Victor. Her strength is far from being as weak as it appears. Otherwise, how did Amelia become an elder? Mr. Rorschach, I'm sorry, can you show me the supreme ring? After Amelia came to Rorschach, she didn't say anything nonsense and said to Rorschach directly. Of course, please feel free to check it. Rorschach handed the ring to Amelia. After Amelia took the ring and made a simple inspection, her face began to become solemn. She subconsciously glanced at Rorschach, and her attitude had changed. Then Amelia bit her finger and dripped a drop of blood onto the ring. It was like dripping water onto a sponge. The blood was immediately absorbed by the ring. At that moment, Amelia also immediately felt a kind of suppression from the blood. Amelia greets the Supreme. Amelia's pupils shrank suddenly, and she immediately said to Rorschach respectfully. Klein, who was following Amelia, also changed his face. He dared not neglect it any more. Together with Amelia, he saluted Rorschach respectfully. Rorschach just nodded lightly, and then took back his ring leisurely. Then he said leisurely, Dracula told me that I will be your master in the future. I don't know if Dracula's words will work with you. Amelia's forehead was sweating all of a sudden. Dracula is the ancestor of their vampires, and is a sacred and inviolable existence among all their undead tribes. This person actually spoke to Dracula in such a casual tone. And Dracula actually handed the ring to the other party, which further shows Dracula's unique attitude towards the other party. As for whether this ring was snatched from Dracula by this person, Amelia didn't think about it at all, because it was simply impossible, like a fairy tale. Dracula is the most powerful existence in the world, comparable to a god. Who can do such an incredible thing? Supreme, you are joking. On behalf of all the undead tribes of our lineage, I express my loyalty to the Supreme. Amelia immediately expressed her loyalty to Rorschach without hesitation. Very good. Rorschach was still very satisfied with Amelia's attitude. He didn't bother to be polite with the other party and directly ordered, 2 things, first, I need a place to stay, second, investigate something for me. What is it? Please tell me, Supreme. Amelia immediately said respectfully. William Stryker, a major in the military, or maybe a lieutenant colonel, I don't remember his rank very clearly, anyway, he has a secret research base on an island, I want you to find out the specific location of that base. Rorschach said to Amelia. Since the matter of the Black Emperor has come to an end, then the next step is naturally to find Stryker to settle accounts. In addition, see if you can trigger a mission or something. In the past, Rorschach also planned to let Charles use the brainwave enhancer to help find it, but the plan did not change quickly, and he did not expect that he and Charles had parted ways before that. In this case, it is naturally not easy for him to ask Charles for help. This is also the reason why Rorschach took over this group of undead people as soon as possible. Although his strength has increased a lot compared to before, and his super hearing can hear farther, Homelander is not Superman after all. In The Black Robe, countless people discussed how to kill Homelander, but Homelander never heard it. Not to mention Homelander, who is still 35%. At present, Rorschach's super hearing can only cover the entire New York. He tried to hear where Stryker was, but he didn't find it. So some things still have to be done with traditional methods. Military Colonel. Amelia showed a look of embarrassment at this time. Supreme, this is probably beyond our ability. Yes, we have indeed developed some connections in human society over the years, but the military is difficult to infiltrate. You didn't lie to me. Rorschach's eyes showed a sharp light, hitting Amelia's face. This is different from the vampires in Rorschach's impression. In Marvel, the infiltration of vampires into human society can be said to be pervasive. I swear in the name of Dracula, everything I said just now is true. Amelia smiled bitterly. Our tribe is not a large tribe. In fact, we can only be regarded as a medium-sized tribe. In this castle, plus our other strongholds, there are only more than 300 people in total. Rorschach frowned slightly. It seems that he had a fixed mindset before, or that he didn't know enough about the intelligence. Vampires are not a monolithic group, but are divided into many different groups. The group in Night actually has only more than 300 people, which is much smaller than Rorschach imagined. This scale has a very limited impact on human society. And Rorschach's impression is actually a modern society decades later, but it is still the 1960s now, so it is naturally not generalized. Rorschach nodded and didn't say much. It seems that it is indeed unrealistic to expect this group of vampires to find Stryker's secret base. But for Rorschach, this is not a big problem. If you can't find the base, then take a step back and find someone, right? And Rorschach also knows someone who knows the location of the secret island. One, or the only one who escaped from Stryker's secret research place. The King of Cards. Wolverine went to Stryker's base to find the King of Cards to lead the way. Even if Stryker can't be found, there are other alternatives. In that case, then help me find William Stryker as quickly as possible. After thinking for a while, Rorschach said to Amelia. Although this is only a medium-sized group of more than 300 people, don't forget that they have existed since the 5th century and have settled in the United States for hundreds of years. In such a long period of time, their infiltration into human society is actually still very amazing. There are shadows of them in all walks of life and all aspects. The power they can mobilize should not be underestimated. Of course there is no problem, Supreme. Amelia agreed without any hesitation, and asked, intimately, at the same time, aside from William Stryker, is there anyone else the Supreme is looking for? Remy LeBeau, nicknamed Gambit. Logan, nicknamed Wolverine. Fred Dukes, nicknamed Meatball. After Rorschach thought for a moment, he named Amelia 3 names one after another. Among the 3 people, Gambit is the one who knows the specific location of the secret base, Meatball is the one who knows where Gambit is, and Wolverine is the one who will find Gambit. Rorschach didn't know what stage the plot of Wolverine had reached, so he could only take a multi-pronged approach and let Amelia look for these people at the same time who might all be able to give him the answer. It's a pity that I have never seen these people and don't know their voices. Rorschach then shook his head with regret and thought. His super hearing can naturally hear the voices of everyone in New York, but there are too many people and too many voices in New York. He doesn't know what kind of sound he wants to hear, and how to filter it. Keywords such as mutant base and secret base were less likely to be heard by Rorschach. Not to mention, those people may not be in New York. So, at present, other than asking these vampires to help you find it, there is really no good way. Superman is not omnipotent, let alone a native of the motherland. And Rorschach is not too anxious about this kind of thing. It's just killing Stryker, it's a matter of squeezing an insect to death, so there's no need to worry so much. Supreme, I have written it all down. Amelia's voice sounded, and she spoke to Rorschach very respectfully. Okay, that's all for now. You hurry up and prepare a house for me, and also equip me with some manpower at my disposal. Rorschach said casually to Amelia again. Klein. Amelia nodded and immediately ordered Klein on the side, go and get the directory of industries controlled by our tribe. Yes, Elder, Klein responded, then quickly turned around and left. But what no one noticed was that the moment Klein turned around, his expression became a little gloomy. The elders of the undead tribe basically don't interfere with daily matters. Klein basically takes care of all matters of the tribe. To put it more bluntly, Klein is a local emperor who is inferior to one person but superior to 10,000 people. He can do whatever he wants and do whatever he wants. But now, a supreme emperor suddenly parachuted into the air. It's strange that he would be happy. Even this kind of errands need to be done by him personally, which is simply ridiculous. When he colluded with the werewolves to create the illusion that the werewolf leader Lucian was killed in exchange for his current transcendent status, he was not used to do this kind of thing. However, Klein naturally knew what the supreme status was among the undead. Since he didn't see even the elder acting like a third grandson, he naturally didn't dare to show any dissatisfaction in his heart. 10 minutes. Klein came back and took out a thick book in his hand. Amelia took it from Klein and handed it to Rorschach respectfully. Supreme, this is the industry that our tribe has been operating for hundreds of years. Please take a look at it. Amelia said respectfully. Rorschach flipped through it casually and gasped, almost saying, what a good guy. Raven and Hank on the side also curiously leaned their heads to take a few glances, and almost made their eyes pop out. Trench. So awesome. After flipping through it twice, I found that there were 3 of this group in the huge family estate similar to Charles's. This is just what I saw by accident while browsing. There are countless other properties such as luxury hotels and bars. Everyone originally thought that Charles was rich, and that he was so rich that people would envy and hate him, but compared to this group of undead, Charles was still a little dwarfed. But think about it, this is the wealth accumulated by more than 300 people over hundreds of years. How can Charles compare it? You have quite a lot of property. Rorschach glanced at Amelia in surprise. Do vampires still have worldly desires? They seem to be not interested in other things besides sucking blood, right? But when he thought about it again, these were just his stereotypes. He didn't understand vampires at all and had no idea what vampires looked like. However, vampires have such a long lifespan. If they don't have any hobbies to pass the time, they will probably die of boredom, right? The Supreme Being is joking, this is all out of necessity. Amelia smiled helplessly. Our tribe is alien to humans and is naturally rejected by humans. If we want to survive safely, we have to feed many mouths. If you want to live with dignity and elegance, it is even more impossible without the support of money. Rorschach understands. He didn't say anything more, casually flipped through the directory, and finally pointed at one of the villas. That's it. Amelia took a look and immediately handed the list to Klein, who was waiting on the side. Arrange it immediately, and also, gather all the tribesmen. Klein immediately went to do it respectfully. As for Amelia, she personally accompanied Rorschach to talk. Rorschach also took this opportunity to learn more about the vampire tribe from her. The atmosphere was speculative. In this process, Rorschach verified his previous guess. In this world, vampires are divided into many tribes, and each tribe is transformed from a supreme without exception. Of course, the reverse relationship is not a one-to-one correspondence, because a supreme can transform into many tribes. For example, the vampire ancestor of the Night series of movies, Alexander Corvinus, is actually a supreme. It's just that this supreme doesn't have much face in front of other supremes. He even ignores his own tribe, which seems to be a bit of a retreat. This also caused Amelia's tribe to be in a slightly awkward situation among all the undead tribes. After understanding this, Rorschach seemed to understand why Amelia was so easily obedient to him, the airborne supreme being. This guy might want to use his hand as the supreme being to improve the status of their tribe. Sure enough, people are driven by interests, and vampires are no exception. However, Rorschach actually doesn't care about this kind of thing. If this undead tribe is really dedicated to him, then why not help them with some things within his ability? Supreme, all the tribes in the castle have been summoned and are waiting in the hall. Look, can we go over now? After chatting with Amelia for a while, Klein turned back and nodded to Amelia. Amelia understood and immediately said respectfully to Rorschach, "Then, go meet everyone." Rorschach pondered for a moment, and without any nonsense, he followed Amelia to the hall. Is there really a supreme here? Didn't the supreme abandon us? It's not Alexander Supreme, it's said to be another supreme. From a distance, Rorschach heard such whispers coming from every corner of the hall. Considering the supreme's transcendent status in the undead tribe, all vampires are very curious about the new supreme and are very looking forward to it. A tribe with a supreme in charge is absolutely different from a tribe without a supreme in charge. Quiet, Elder Amelia is here. Hush, silence. With the appearance of Amelia, Klein, and Rorschach, the originally noisy hall suddenly became quiet. Swish. One gaze after another was directed at Rorschach. This one is the new supreme, right? You can tell by looking at Elder Amelia's appearance. But this supreme is still human, and has not yet truly transformed into the undead. Is Elder Amelia so respectful? Delight, curiosity, surprise, indifference, and so on. All kinds of emotions appeared on the faces of the vampires, and there were so many. Everyone, I believe you have heard from Klein that our tribe is very honored to welcome a supreme. Our tribe will no longer be rootless, and we will also have the protection of the supreme. This is the honor of our tribe. Everyone, let me introduce to you solemnly. The person next to me is the supreme Rorschach, who we need to be loyal to in the future. In the eyes of all the vampires, Amelia solemnly announced Rorschach's identity to everyone. Supreme Rorschach, I, Amelia, swear allegiance to you as the elder of the tribe. Then, Amelia turned around again, stood opposite Rorschach, bowed deeply to Rorschach, and solemnly swore to Rorschach. With Amelia's action, the vampires standing in the room behind her also bowed their heads to Rorschach together. Everyone, get up. It was not until Rorschach's voice sounded that everyone stood up again. Although some people still expressed some doubts about Rorschach, in this situation, naturally no one would be so stupid as to slap him in the face. They are all old monsters who have lived for countless years, and they would not be so naive. Supreme, these are the tribes currently living in the castle. Amelia stood up again at this time, pointing at everyone to introduce Rorschach. This is Khan, the best warrior in our tribe, and also the captain of our guard. This is Selena, who is also a brave warrior and has made great contributions in our years of war with werewolves. As Amelia introduced, Rorschach's eyes fell on the female warrior standing in the crowd, wearing a black tights, with a very cold but delicate face. Selena, the well-deserved heroine in the Night series. I have to say, she is really beautiful. Moreover, Serena's beauty is different from those ordinary women. Her beauty also reveals a kind of heroism, and she is very smart and capable. To some extent, she has something in common with that annoying woman Peggy Carter. Feeling Rorschach's gaze, Serena also looked up and glanced at Rorschach. Compared with others, she seemed more calm and restrained. But she was more indifferent. For Serena, the Supreme and the like had little to do with her. What she wanted to do was how to eliminate the werewolves. However, things can't always go as one wishes. After Amelia briefly introduced the backbone of the tribe to Rorschach, she began to ask for Rorschach's opinion. Rorschach wanted Rorschach to choose the person he was satisfied with. She's the one. As a result, Rorschach directly chose Serena. For Rorschach, Serena was the most capable, the most beautiful, and the one with the least messy and crooked thoughts. Who else could he choose if not her? And this is the heroine. If you don't meet her, it's fine. Since you meet her, how can you let her go? Selena, choose some confidants for yourself, and you will work with me from now on. Rorschach pointed at Selena and said to her casually. Shua. In an instant, one gaze after another was cast on Selena, mostly with envy, jealousy and hatred. Chosen by the Supreme, Selena can be said to have soared to the sky, and even the elders will not dare to do anything to Selena in the future. Of course, even now, Selena's status in the tribe is not low, and Elder Victor is her biggest backer. This is also why Selena has always been self-willed and even ignored Klein, but she is still thriving in the tribe. She was already favored by God, and now she was chosen by the Supreme. How could this woman be so lucky? Everyone was envious. However, Selena herself was much more indifferent, and even subconsciously opened her mouth to refuse. Compared with hunting werewolves, she didn't want to follow the Supreme. Of course, Selena also knew the status of the Supreme. Even if she was reckless, she would not be so unrestrained. In the end, she still didn't say anything against it. Selena, did you hear what the Supreme said? Amelia looked down at Selena and asked. Yes, Supreme. Selena nodded and responded. Amelia was relieved. Selena was simply spoiled by Victor. She was really afraid that Selena would do something weird at this time. Fortunately, Selena was able to tell the limits. There was nothing to say next. Amelia took Rorschach back to the reception room and entertained him personally. The other things Rorschach ordered were undoubtedly carried out efficiently and quickly. It was only in the afternoon that Rorschach, escorted by a team of luxury cars, arrived at an equally luxurious villa. Supreme, please wait a moment. In front of the luxury villa, Serena, dressed in black and holding a parasol, suddenly spoke and stopped Rorschach, who was about to enter. What's wrong, Serena? Rorschach glanced at Serena next to him with a surprised look. Please let my people do the necessary checks first, Serena said to Rorschach with a serious face. Although following Rorschach was not Serena's original intention, now that she has decided to follow Rorschach, Serena is still more conscientious. That's not necessary. When Luo Sha heard this, he smiled and waved his hand. With his current super hearing, he could be sure that there was no ambush in the room. If you scan it with a clairvoyant eye, you can also confirm that no bombs or bugs have been installed. These are all expected things. After all, Rorschach doesn't have that many enemies. This is his first time moving to this place. How could he be targeted by others? Supreme, ensuring your safety is the top priority. Please let me do my job. Serena was very insistent. It won't take long. Fine. Seeing Serena's stubborn look, Rorschach could only spread his hands. It only took a few minutes, and it wasn't like he couldn't wait. Serena didn't say any nonsense, and immediately nodded to several of her men, 4 of whom immediately hurried into the villa. As for the remaining 2, they stayed with Rorschach together with Serena. It is worth mentioning that, except for Serena, who is a vampire, the others in the group were humans, loyal humans controlled by Serena's tribe. This was specifically requested by Rorschach. Otherwise, living with a group of vampires would always feel weird. What? Serena is also a vampire. Vampires and vampires are also different, right? Isn't that too exaggerated, Hank? Raven couldn't help but whisper to Hank on the side. It was the first time for her to have bodyguards accompanying her. Ahem, Ruiwen, let's talk after we go in. Hank adjusted his glasses and whispered to Raven. He was really not used to talking about others in front of others, especially those who were their bodyguards. He always felt weird. Even now he still feels dizzy. How could Rorschach become the supreme leader of that undead tribe so confusingly? Also known as Supreme. Just exaggerate. While Hank was thinking wildly, several vampires who went into the villa to check had returned and nodded to Serena. Serena then respectfully made a gesture of invitation to Rorschach. Supreme, you can go in now. Rorschach then took Hank and Raven into the luxurious and spacious villa. As for Serena and others, they automatically guarded and stood guard in various places. He didn't bother Rorschach and the others. They still know their position very well. Wow, Rorschach, is this our new home from now on? It was only then that Ruiwen screamed excitedly. She looked at the luxurious decoration and felt excited. Ruiwen, this is Luo Sha's home, we are just staying here. Hank was equally excited, but he was relatively restrained. No, Hank, this is our home. Luo Sha smiled at the two of them and waved his hands to them. Let's each choose a room. Hank and Raven immediately ran away happily. Luo Sha leisurely came to the balcony, looked out at the yard with flowers and plants, felt the sunshine coming in from the window, and felt very comfortable. This is where Rorschach temporarily settled. Here, Rorschach will start a new journey. CIA headquarters. Meeting room. The long conference room was filled with people. In addition to Director Hansen, there were also leaders from other relevant departments. Among them are some familiar faces who have appeared at the round table of the Ministry of National Defense. Surprisingly, he is also the boss of the room. At this moment, all the big boss's eyes were focused on the female agent sitting at the end. Mora, tell us, what happened in Cuba, and who sank the fleets of the United States and the Soviet Union? Director Hansen's eyes were like daggers, and he struck Mora in the face and asked in a deep voice. Cuba, Director, what do you mean? Have I been to Cuba? I'm sorry, I don't know why, but I don't remember what happened during this time. However, Mora had a confused look on her face and said to Hansen very innocently. Don't remember. Mora, what are you talking about? Are you telling me that you have lost your memory? Director Hansen's brows suddenly wrinkled like old chrysanthemums blooming in late autumn. Big bosses from so many departments are here. Agent Mora, what kind of plane are you doing? Isn't this a blatant slap in the face of me, the director? I think I have indeed lost my memory. But Mora nodded with a serious face. I don't know what's wrong with my head, but my memory these days is blank. Seeing the serious look on Mora's face, Director Hansen also realized that the other party did not seem to be lying. Suddenly, a flash of inspiration flashed through Director Hansen's mind. He remembered that there was a guy in the mutant team who could control other people's minds. Could it be that person who deleted Mora's memory? Logically speaking, this kind of thing is still very possible. Director Hansen thought to himself that if he destroyed the US and Soviet fleets, he would naturally not leave any evidence. An intelligence agent like Mora would have been killed 10,000 times. However, Mora survived. This means that the other party is sure that Mora will not pose any threat to them. Mora's memory has been erased. Director Hansen's face became ugly, and it seemed that this was probably the case. So Director Hansen explained to the big guys about the mutant who could control other people's minds. The big guys are not stupid, and they can naturally tell that this is indeed a logical inference, otherwise it is really unreasonable for Mora to still be alive. Yes, erasing memory, he can indeed do that, so what do you remember? Director Hansen did not hold much hope, and continued to ask Mora with no confidence. Just some fragments flashed occasionally. Mora was recalling by himself, for example, big trees, sunshine, a kiss. God, a group of big men almost cursed. What kind of shitty fragments are you flashing back? It's completely useless. A kiss, is it appropriate for you to recall a kiss at this time? A crazy woman. There is no doubt, the CIA's trip was in vain. Before coming, the big men were full of hope, and each of them was ready to do a big job. Even everyone had prepared some corresponding plans in their minds, and once it was confirmed that it was mutants who destroyed their fleet, they would immediately implement them. But who could have thought? It was a waste of effort. Mutants are really good at tricks. With Mora's amnesia, the truth of Cuba will be buried in the darkness forever, and no one will know how the fleets of the United States and the Soviet Union sank. Not only that, the United States will become a joke of the world and be ridiculed by various countries. So, how do we explain the Cuban affairs to the people? For so many days, the whole country has been waiting for our explanation. After a moment of silence, a big man asked this very critical question. The truth. The military big man uttered such a sentence from his mouth, we tell them the truth. The big men at the scene looked at each other, and no one raised any objections. Everyone knows that this is the only way. Everyone also knows what the truth in the mouth of the military big man refers to. Except for mutants, no one can pay for the sinking of the Cuban fleet. The emotions of the people need to be vented, and this is the only way. As for whether it was done by mutants, what happened in Cuba, is it still important now? The truth. Mora couldn't help but frowned. Excuse me, sir, the truth you are talking about is that the so-called mutants destroyed our fleet. This has not been confirmed, how can it be called the truth? Director Hansen, please take care of your own people. The military leader was too lazy to pay attention to Mora, and just said to Director Hansen leisurely. Agent Mora, there is nothing for you here, you can leave. Director Hansen immediately sent Mora away. November 17th. The spokesperson of the White Palace of the United States held a press conference and explained in detail the series of terrible and infuriating things that happened in Cuba. When I first received this news, I was as shocked and unbelievable as you, but the facts in front of us force us to admit that we are not the only masters of the earth. Around us, there may be such a group of mutants with various abilities and extremely dangerous. Yes, mutants exist. We must face this cruel thing. Only one mutant who can manipulate metal destroyed our fleet, so what about others? What abilities and powers do they have? The president, who smiled brightly, also personally accepted an interview with the media, expressing his condolences for the sinking of the Cuban fleet, and also expressed his panic about the mutants group. Of course, he also warned all citizens of the United States to remain vigilant, because this group is a very dangerous group. For a time, the whole country was in an uproar. The world was shocked. In everyone's common perception, the fleet of the United States is the most powerful force in the world, and it is the basis for the United States to become a world superpower. Not to mention that in the original confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States deployed a total of 68 Air Force squadrons, 8 aircraft carriers, and a super fleet of 90 warships in the Cuban Strait. To put it bluntly, this kind of power is enough to flatten a small country. However, such a terrifying force was actually destroyed by a few people. If it weren't for the official statement of the White Palace, if it weren't for the president's solemn speech, who would believe it? After the United States issued a relevant statement, the big bear country on the other side immediately did the same thing. They also explained to their own country and other countries that paid close attention to this matter the truth that the mutants destroyed their fleet. That's it. The group of mutants that no one knew about at all, and even if someone occasionally heard of it, they only regarded it as nonsense, suddenly became a hot fried chicken. It can be said that it has completely become popular. Even 3-year-old children know that mutants are terrible monsters, and they should call the police immediately when they see them. Eliminate mutants. Down with mutants. Defend our country. Not long after the official statement ended, mass demonstrations broke out in many places in the United States and the Great Bear. Many people petitioned in front of the White Palace and the Federal Presidential Palace, inviting their governments to send forces to eliminate this dangerous group. For a time, the situation in the two countries fell into such chaos. Ordinary people can be said to be in danger. The sales of guns and ammunition soared several times in the first time. Many places were directly sold out. Who are the people frantically buying guns to prevent and deal with? There is no need to explain it. For a time, mutants have become the world's public enemy. Inside the luxurious villa, after the president's speech, all cities fell into panic. I believe that everyone has the same question as me at this moment. How many mutants are there in this world? Where are they hiding? On the TV screen, a female host in a professional dress was broadcasting about mutants. The background behind her was a chaotic scene of angry crowds on the street. Raven and Hank were sitting on the spacious and comfortable sofa in the living room, but they had no time to enjoy themselves at the moment. Their brows were all wrinkled like an old chrysanthemum blooming in late autumn. How could this happen? How could this happen? Raven couldn't stand it anymore. She rushed to the TV with an irritated look on her face, constantly changing channels. But it was useless. No matter how Raven changed channels, the screen was full of reports about mutants. At this moment, mutants were really sweeping the screen. Rorschach, although it's a bit late to say this now, I think Charles might be right. I should have tried to stop you and Eric at that time. Hank's brows were also wrinkled like an old chrysanthemum blooming in late autumn, with deep worry on his face. When Rorschach and Eric joined forces to destroy the fleets of the two countries, they expected that mutants would be put on the fire in the near future. But when this moment really came, Raven and Hank were still caught off guard. They did not expect that the situation would be so serious. Mutants have become rats crossing the street that everyone wants to kill, and everyone wants to get rid of them as soon as possible. If this situation continues, will mutants still have a way to survive? Hank regretted it. Raven also regretted it. When seeing their compatriots in such a dire situation, anyone who is not as extreme as Eric will probably regret it more or less. So does Rorschach regret it? Rorschach does not regret it. Even if he had to do it again, Rorschach would still do it. The situation of mutants seems to be worse now, but when has the situation of mutants been better? Even if he and Eric had not joined forces to destroy the fleet of the United States would still not let the mutants go, because this is human nature. When people face a powerful force that they cannot control, they will destroy it without hesitation. After all, in the original Time and Space without Rorschach's intervention, Eric was successfully stopped by Charles, so what was the fate of the mutants? A large number of mutants were captured by the government for dissection and experiments, and were forced to go to the battlefield. Various weapons targeting mutants emerged one after another, and even robots that could identify the X gene were invented. What changes have been made in the situation of mutants? It's just not as intense as it is now. Of course, the current predicament faced by mutants is inseparable from Rorschach's actions, so Rorschach did not intend to stand idly by. After all, if he hadn't intervened, Eric would not have been able to destroy the fleet. Rorschach should bear a large part of the responsibility for the fact that mutants are now being beaten by everyone. He is not the kind of person who would just sit back and relax after making a mess. Rorschach, what should we do? We should do something, right? Rorschach, please tell me what you are going to do. Raven's voice sounded, and she kept talking to Rorschach anxiously. At this time, what else can we do? Hank shook his head dejectedly. No, Hank, of course we can do something. Rorschach said leisurely. Raven and Hank beside him heard the words, and their eyes suddenly lit up. Rorschach, I knew you wouldn't just watch our compatriots suffer. Raven said to Luo Shaw with relief and excitement. But Rorschach, what are you going to do? Hank pushed up his glasses and looked at Rorschach curiously. The beautiful country slandered us mutants as murderous executioners, distorted the facts of what happened in Cuba, and caused the world to have a huge prejudice against us mutants. First of all, naturally, the world should know the truth and give us mutants justice. Rorschach thought for a moment, then looked at Raven and Hank with a long look. He and Eric destroyed the fleets of the two countries. Rorschach would not deny this, but there was an important prerequisite for all this, and that was that the fleets of the two countries attacked them first. This point is very important. But in the beautiful country, there was naturally no mention of this. They completely described mutants like Rorschach and Eric as lunatics like Shao who planned to destroy the world. The fleets of the two countries completely became pitiful victims. Rorschach said he would not accept this kind of shit. Mimeo wanted to confuse right and wrong in front of Luo Shaw, but Luo Shaw said he would not accept this trick. Rorschach, tell me, what are we going to do? We need to do something. Raven said to Rorschach enthusiastically. Let's go pick up one of our compatriots first. Rorschach was mysterious and authentic. What compatriots? You'll know it when you see it. Rorschach continued to smile and said to Raven. It can be said that Raven's curiosity was piqued all of a sudden, but it was obvious that Luo Shaw was trying to sell things off, so Raven did not continue to ask further questions. It's just that I'm looking forward to it even more. Come on, Raven, don't keep our compatriots waiting too long. Luo Sha stood up immediately and called out to Raven, who naturally followed him happily. Rorschach, what about me? Hank also stood up in a hurry, chased after him, looked straight at Rorschach and asked. Hank, Raven and I are enough for this operation. Just stay here and wait for us to come back. Rorschach said to Hank casually. I know, be careful. Hank nodded, but a hint of sadness flashed across his face. For a long time, Hank has almost always been a soy sauce presence in various actions, and cannot provide any effective help to everyone. At least it was like this in several operations against Xiao, with the exception of the Cuban team. Hank acted as a pilot for everyone. In the past, Hank had Raven as his companion, which made Hank feel a little comforted. But now, even Raven has to follow Luo Sha. But he could only stay at home. This made Hank feel very frustrated and made him feel like a waste. Hank, everyone has their strengths, and what you are good at is not on the battlefield. Rorschach saw Hank's somewhat disappointed look, so he couldn't help but said to him with a serious face, in fact, in some fields, you are irreplaceable. Really, but which fields are they? Rorschach, I also want to help, sincerely. Hank thought Rorschach was comforting himself, especially now that our compatriots are facing such a bad situation. I also want to do something. Hank, if you really want to help, you will have a chance. We have a lot of things waiting for you to make. Rorschach thought for a while and said to Hank in a deep voice. Hank's eyes lit up and he asked hurriedly, what? Like? Brainwave enhancer, Blackbird fighter, etc. Rorschach gave 2 examples casually. Brainwave enhancer. Rorschach, except Charles, no one can use that thing. Raven on the side showed a look of confusion on her face. Raven, Charles is not the only one with psychic abilities. Rorschach said meaningfully to Raven and Hank. Recalling what Rorschach said just now, Raven and Hank could naturally guess that the compatriot Rorschach was going to pick up this time was probably a psychic. Hank nodded. I have successfully built it before, and it is not a problem to build it again, but Rorschach, that requires a lot of money, and this place is not suitable. That's exactly what you do next, Hank. Rorschach continued to say to Hank, I will let Serena connect with you. You are responsible for choosing a suitable base for us and completing the modification of the base. Money is not an issue. Just tell me how much you need. A base. Hank's eyes lit up when he heard this, a base for mutants. Rorschach, will we welcome many compatriots in the future? Yes, Hank, you and Raven will be the housekeepers of the base from now on, and you will be busy from now on. Rorschach smiled and patted Hank on the shoulder. The butler of the mutant base. Sounds very good. It can be said that at this moment, Hank and Raven were full of fighting spirit and full of strength. Because it sounds like a great cause. Supreme, are you going out? Serena on the side saw Rorschach leading Raven towards the door, so she immediately came over and asked. After receiving a positive reply, Selena immediately ordered someone to make arrangements. Soon, a low-key and luxurious black Mercedes was driven to the compound and in front of Rorschach. Rorschach declined the driver arranged by Selena and only took Raven with him, and the two set off in a hurry. A few hours later, the black Mercedes slowly stopped on the side of the road. Raven looked through the car window at a majestic building not far away that symbolized one of the highest powers in the United States, and her voice could not help but rise several octaves. Rorschach, is this where you pick people up? CIA headquarters. Raven was completely stimulated. Rorschach was not kidding her, was he? But seeing Rorschach's serious look, Raven also knew that Rorschach was serious. Yes, there is one of our compatriots imprisoned here. Like Charles, she has telepathic abilities. Rorschach briefly introduced to Raven, she will be our first target for recruitment. Yes, Rorschach was talking about the White Queen, the former Black Emperor Xiao's trusted confidant. To be honest, telepathy is indeed a very powerful ability, and it can also play a very important role in Rorschach's future actions and plans. And the White Queen can completely block Charles's telepathy, and her ability is not necessarily worse than Charles's. The White Queen can even implant an illusion in people out of thin air, which is a skill that Charles does not even have. Isn't it a pity that such a talent is given to Eric? I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.